At any rate, let me give you a rundown of what you're going to be hearing this evening. We're going to take a look at an account from the Iranian Mujahideen, namely the people rebelling against Ayatollah Khomeini, that in fact the United States is still selling arms to Iran. That may change, but that will serve as sort of a kicker for the broadcast this evening. After that, we're going to take a look at a fantastic article, one of many dug up for us by our Italian translator, Dave, and again, the fellow who's been basically paying the price for doing this kind of excellent and revelatory work. We're going to take a look at some very, very interesting connections between Italian and French fascists and the Iranian Islamic militants who have, been holding sway in Iran for the last 8 years and have been dominating the headlines in the last couple of days or so. Then we're going to take a look at the intersection, first of all, between an Italian fascist named Milioli, another Italian fascist named Franco Freda, both affiliated with the Piazza Fontana and Bologna bombings, and the Iranian Islamic militants. We're also going to take a look, interestingly enough, at the involvement of Iranian militants in Italy, the same forces and elements of the Red Brigades, a Red Brigade unit called the Fighting Communist Proletariat, or Fighting Communist Party, as it's now known. Interestingly enough, that group took credit for the assassination last April of an Italian senator named Ruffili, who, interestingly enough, just happened to have been on the commission that investigated the Propaganda Due Lodge. They do tend to work that way. Then we're going to look at a very fine article which will anticipate, in many ways, next week's material. This is an article from the Oakland Tribune by Kevin Coogan and Marty Lee, and it will deal with connections between French fascists and Iranian militants, and in particular a fellow named Francois Genoud, who was a Nazi intelligencer from World War II, a Swiss Nazi financier, and a fellow very much involved with the Nazi-generated Middle Eastern terrorism that we focused on in RFAs 4, 22, and 31 and 32, to one extent or another. Then we're going to play a segment, a long tape segment, maybe 45 to 50 minutes or so. That is going to consist of some material from a book called Unhealed Wounds by Erna Paris, a book both Nip and I stand on with both feet. One of the best books I think ever written about the actual dynamics of world fascism and international terrorism and how they work together. This is going to deal with the intersection of people like Francois Genoud, Jacques Verges, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the SS major who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and much of the third position direct action Middle Eastern terrorist milieu, which is going to occupy the focus for tonight's broadcast. After that, we're going to take a look. Well, after that, we're going to take a break. Then we're going to take a look at a group called the Giuliani Group, which is a group of Italian gangsters which was affiliated both with right and left-wing terrorism. They lurk in the background of the Bologna bombing. They also are hooked up with a group of Red Brigade terrorists called the Fighting Communist Union. Now, that's different from the Fighting Communist Proletariat or Fighting Communist Party. We're talking PCC and UCC, although the PCC and UCC seem to be pretty much two different sides of the same unfortunate coin.
CC.
Yep. And we're going to take a look, first of all, at the intersection between the Giuliani Group and the UCC, the Fighting Communist Union. Then we're going to take a look at the interesting link-up between the Fighting Communist Union, their assassination of an Italian Star Wars general, Licio Gelli, and we're going to take a look at the investigating commission, the people investigating that crime, and their stop-off in, of all places, Istanbul, Turkey, which led Italian journalists to speculate that they were possibly looking once again into, that's right, Mehmet Ali Aja and the shooting of Pope John Paul II. You notice some Turks were recently threatening the Pope. There have been a lot of things happening on the Turkish front. The Turkish Premier Özal escaped assassination at the hands of a gray wolf, then immediately came to the United States, and he, I guess, was about to complain about a reduction in U.S. aid. I wonder if perhaps he received some instructions along with that bullet, and if perhaps that toned down his ire somewhat. Then the Pope goes to Austria to talk with Kurt Waldheim, and a couple of Turks are supposedly threatening him, although now the Austrian authorities have said that was just a hoax. It's interesting that the Turkish front, so to speak, seems to be heating up at the same time. We're going to take a look again at the trip to Istanbul, Turkey, of the people investigating the link between the Fighting Communist Union and Licio Gelli, an assassinated Italian Star Wars general. Then we're going to take a look at another almost predictable development from the standpoint of long-time One Step Beyond and Radio Free America listeners, namely the fact that in a Red Brigade's hideout, it was discovered that the Red Brigades were showing a lot of interest in Judge Carlo Palermo, the fellow who began investigating the Stee-Bomb Arms for Drugs ring, which figures not only in the shooting of Pope John Paul II, but apparently also in the Iran-Contra scandal. As we've seen, those two have dovetailed very nicely. Then we're going to take a look at a connection between the Giuliani Group the group hooked up with the fighting Communist Union, and the assassination of Aldo Moro, and we'll talk more about that later, and connections between the Giuliani group, the Red Brigades involved in the Moro killing, and, that's right, some of the people involved with Stibom. And we're going to close with an interesting article from the Swiss Journal about Licio Gelli and some of the things he's been saying in Italy. And when Licio speaks, many, many people quake in their boots in Italy, and that's exactly what this article says. The boy is rattling them bones, and a lot of people are sweating under the arms in Italy. Okay, first article. And research credit on this goes to another one of our listeners, not Dave, our Italian translator, but a fellow named Jim, who used to be our phone screener here and is still on deck and doing some magnificent work. This article was carried in a lot of the local papers. Jim dug this up for us out of the Los Angeles Times of June 28th of 1988. It's a story by Norman Kempster of the LA Times. It's datelined Washington and headlined, Khomeini still secretly getting U.S. arms, Iranian rebels charge. Anti-Khomeini Iranian rebels have captured documents indicating that the Iranian government continues to obtain weapons from the United States, a senior rebel official claimed Monday. Soon, in a press conference, we will reveal documents showing that weapons are still going to the regime from the United States, Moshen Rezai, who functions as foreign minister for the rebels, told reporters. He was in Washington for a rally to celebrate the rebels' victory earlier this month in the Iranian border town of Mehran. The Reagan administration maintains that it halted all weapons deliveries to Iran after the Iran-Contra scandal broke almost 2 years ago. Rezai's trip is part of a campaign by the Mujahideen, the rebel organization, to establish its credibility as a serious opposition group that might someday displace the government of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And so again, we don't know, we can't obviously verify those reports 100%, but it is consistent with something that we've seen over the years, which is that the United States has a very interesting way of arming an awful lot of the people it winds up going into battle against. And again, people should consider the possible motives for this, whether perhaps the arms deals are being used as vehicles for infiltration. In a very key section from Le Matin in June of 1984 that we went over in Radio Free America number 20, in discussing how arms deals are used as an instrument of foreign policy, Glauco Partel, a fellow from the Stibom Arms for Drug Ring, was describing that the illicit under-the-table sale of arms serves as a very effective device of foreign policy because it permits the circulation of bribes and thereby political control. And what he didn't say is it also permits infiltration and the eventual co-opting of some of these terrorist groups. And again, the theme of tonight's broadcast, I guess, is the merging of the left and right for whatever purpose. That is the fascist third position. And we're going to be taking a look at some of the connections between Islamic fundamentalists, Palestinian activists and terrorists, and ultra-fascists both in Italy, France, and also in the United States. And again, one of the things that lurks in the background of all of this is Ali North, his connections with Mansour el-Qassar of Abu Abbas fame and Abu Nidal fame, and some of the interesting connections between the Reagan White House, which is inveigled so heavily against inveigled, is that the word? Inveigled, I think, against terrorism so heavily over the years, and yet seems to be hooked up with so many of the very terrorists that it professes to be opposed to.
Just like the Reaganites and the Qaddafyites seem as if they must be at opposite ends of the spectrum, but when you look a little more closely, you find out they're working together. Just as Licio Gelli and his right-wing para-fascist friends in Italy and the Ayatollah's folks in Iran seem like they must be at opposite ends of the spectrum, and then when you examine a little more closely, you find that they are in fact quite similar and quite connected. Well, in the same way, something we were talking about at the beginning of the broadcast, and I wanted to underline again, in the same way, those of us who are out there receiving this kind of stuff, having it handed to us as daily news, no matter how different we all are, we're in the same position too. In other words, if you're somebody who is going to see this story, for instance, about the Iranian airline that we've been talking about a little bit tonight, it's been shot down. If you're the kind of slack-jawed idiot who's going to open the paper tomorrow and say, well, son of a gun, I guess they had it coming. Or conversely, if you are the kind of person who's going to pick it up and say, oh, how horrible, what a terrible thing to happen. Whether you're somebody who's going to blame the Reagan administration, whether you're somebody who's going to blame the Ayatollah Khomeini, the differences are not so important as the fact that you're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat on this, which is we have been manipulated, and we are continuing to be manipulated. And as long as we believe these stories that are handed out, No matter what we believe or how we react to them, we are being manipulated. We are not reacting to the real news.
One of the concepts to bear in mind as you listen to what the long article Nip is about to read you, and again, this all of the articles with two exceptions this evening were gleaned for us by Dave, our Italian translator, and he's not from Italy, but he translates the Italian press for us. The Germans have a term called Interessengemeinschaft, or community of interest. There's no precise English equivalent. That's what the IG in IG Farben stands for, and it means a community of interest. It doesn't necessarily imply a conspiracy, although it implies that indirectly, but it implies that after a while people learn which pellet to push which lever to push in order to get their food pellet. One of the things to think about is the relative domestic bankruptcy of the policies both of Ronald Reagan and the Ayatollah Khomeini. Both have been a stone disaster on the home front, and really, I think people should think about the extent to which each of these aging, sick old men has been able to rule primarily by whipping up the war Fuhrer and waving the flag and invoking the names of their martyred young men, etc., and basically to create a media circus and sort of a mini Nuremberg rally. People should consider that particular tactic and see to what extent people like Muammar Gaddafi, people like Ayatollah Khomeini, and people who would appear to be on the opposite side of the spectrum, and note the use of the term appear, like Ronald Reagan, in fact, have many things in common, and that if they learn to perhaps send a few people out to get killed, and they may learn that eventually they have, it's worth keeping each other around because they can keep each other in power.
Symbiosis is the word. We are going to read one of the aforementioned Italian translations, this one from Panorama magazine of February 14th, 1988, and you'll hear a bunch of names you don't know, some of them you may know, and we'll go back and straighten some of this up for you. Anyway, from Panorama, again, translated by Dave, our Italian translator. Surprise! In the same Vicenza post box, messages arrive for both militants of the extreme right and friends of the Islamic Students Association. For the DIGOS, the DIGOS, who'd already picked up signals of solidarity between Iranians and the NAR, this is the chance for vigorous inquiries. In Rovigo, in the home of Giovanni Melioli, a neo-fascist defendant in the Bologna trial, that's the Bologna railway station bombing trial, appears other pro-Khomeini material. The Italian, quote, the Italian popular vanguards express solidarity with the Iranian people, quote, unquote. A glance among the letters and pamphlets gives understanding to the head of DIGOS. DIGOS in this case is the investigating agency. Giuseppe Palomeni, an investigating magistrate, Felice Casson, that contacts between Italian neo-fascists and Iranian exiles are solid. Let me just give you that's the meat of it right there. A glance among the letters and pamphlets gives understanding to the head of DIGOS, Giuseppe Palomeni, and investigating magistrate Felice Casson that contacts between Italian neo-fascists and Iranian exiles are solid. Our story begins in the Venice apartment of Abedi Tari, T-A-R-I, a 37-year-old student. Police find lots of money and evidence of big or long trips. The best secrets are messages written in Arabic directly from the Tehran government. For some time, it's been known that Italian neo-fascists, especially friends of Franco Freda, F-R-E-D-A, recently acquitted for the Piazza Fontana massacre, have been attracted to Islam via, quote, exiles from Marxism and capitalism, unquote. Freda, interviewed by Panorama, says, quote, for one who is anti-American, anti-Soviet, and anti-Zionist like me, Khomeiniism is a hope. One has to go back to the 13th century to find another experience so bright, unquote. Freda's admiration for Iran's leader goes back many years. Quote, when Khomeini was in exile in Paris, some of my comrades brought him my books and he deigned to bless them, unquote. Old acquaintances like Professor Claudio Muti want to give legal aid to an Islamic-leaning magazine called Jad, J-A-D.
I suspect that may be Jihad.
It could be, or it could just be the Italian version of Jihad, published in Carmagnola. Skipping down. Abedi Tari, investigators suspect, this is the 37-year-old student, investigators suspect may not be alone. From here it goes to other inquiries in Padua, Milan, Genoa, Rome, Perugia, Lecce, Reggio Calabria, and Catania. In Catania, in the mosque on Via Castomarini, a meeting is uncovered between the Islamic Students Association and the lawyer Michele Papa, Gaddafi's representative in Sicily. Undoubtedly an interesting circumstance, but still not enough to make a determined step in the investigation. Abedi Tari, we should just, we'll mention that later.
Yeah, I think probably there's such a long article, and all these articles are so involved, plus it's translated, that maybe we should probably go back and hit each point as we go through.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. Among other things, they mentioned Michele Papa, Gaddafi's representative in Sicily. Now, Gaddafi, as longtime listeners to the show know, Gaddafi has a longtime affiliation with the Italian left and with the O-line fascist European left in general, including
European right.
European right. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But actually it is.
Yeah, I was going to say,
fascist European left.
We're going to flip-flop back and forth on this a lot tonight. Gaddafi has a long-time relationship with the European right, including one of the leaders ever since the end of World War II of the European right, Otto Skorzeny, who, with Muammar Gaddafi, funded the Paladin Group, which was part of the International Fascista, which is about as far to the right as you can get.
One of the things, too, we're not going to have time to get into them this evening, perhaps in one of the future broadcasts on the subject. You heard the name there, Michele Papa. Now, that's an interesting fellow who is he's Gaddafi's representative in Italy, as the article indicates. He's also a fellow who hooks up with Italian fascists, and although the name may not be too familiar to Americans, he helped decide the 1980 election by working with Francesco Pazienza and Michael Ledeen on the Billygate story. And, of course, Mo Gaddafi comes into that one, too. More later.
That's right. So, a meeting between the Islamic Students Association and the aforementioned Michele Papa, Gaddafi's representative in Sicily. Abedi Tari is the leader of a group composed of 8 Iranian students, a Syrian, and a Lebanese. The group moves from city to city, organizes, quote, general European seminaries, unquote, probably seminars, and telephones, analogous working groups in Paris and Bonn. In Italy, it's been operating since 1984 and already has an imposing mass of index card files on, quote, enemies of the revolution, unquote. Skipping down in the article. The investigators keep wiretaps. Sometimes they run into words like, before I start this, I want to mention, we're going to see an example of who an enemy of the revolution, according to these people, appears to be, or the kind of person that seems to be an enemy of the revolution. We talk about Senator Ruffili a little later on. The investigators keep wiretaps. Sometimes they run into words like arms, carpets, drugs. Witnesses confirm that Abedi Tari was seen supervising arms shipments to Iran in the ports of Venice and Talamone. The suspicions remain simply that, until Abedi calls a number in Genoa. It corresponds to the Islamic Republic Shipping Company. Digos, again the investigating agency, seizes documents that reveal an arms traffic. The company in Genoa puts police on the trail of 3 others very important in the field of commerce and the manufacture of arms and explosives. The European Armaments Company, SEA, in Turin, Consar, C-O-N-S-A-R, in Rome, and Remie, R-E-M-I-E, in Vicenza. The documents seized are really explosive. They reveal a traffic not only to Iran from Italy, but also to Iran from Bulgaria, France, West Germany, even Yugoslavia. Digos finds plane tickets at SEA that prove trips carried out by Tehran's rulers. In Vicenza, as a result of evidence found at the Remie Company, police reopened their investigation into a Red Brigades faction which used the obsolete name, quote, Fighting Communist Proletariat, or, its initials in Italian, PCC. Okay, let me give that to you again because we're going to get into the UCC later on. Okay, so Digos, investigating this connection between the Islamic student group and their connection with various shipping companies who are sending arms to Iran, finds plane tickets proving trips carried out by Tehran's rulers, and in Vicenza, as a result of evidence found at the Remie Company, police reopened their investigation into a Red Brigades faction which used the obsolete name Fighting Communist Proletariat, otherwise known as the PCC. The instigators of an abortive attack last February, the PCC, the instigators of an abortive attack last February. And it's uncovered in Rome that the Consar company is connected, along with SEA, to the French arms maker Luchaire. Okay, so again, a very complex web of names. Some of them, as Dave mentioned, we've heard already. Certainly Franco Freda, we've talked about the Piazza Fontana massacre bombing, the Bologna railway station bombing, very familiar to us. One of the things most familiar to us about these is the involvement of a man by the name of Stefano Della Chiai. Stefano Della Chiai, of course, linked heavily to not only to Licio Gelli, who we'll talk about later, and we've talked about a great deal, but to European fascism in general, and also to something called the third position, the terza posizione, the strange Maoist Hitlerite philosophy that has been used as an excuse for certain terrorist activities that seem to benefit nobody except the extreme right.
Not only Hitler and Mao, but also Gaddafi. The slogan is Hitler and Mao united in struggle, and they use a philosophy, and it's a fascist philosophy. It should be noted, this is not a progressive philosophy. It uses a fascist philosophy, which is an infusion of Hitler, Mao, and Mo Gaddafi. And the Piazza Fontana massacre is interesting, too, because one of the people indicted in that was a P2 Italian intelligence official and fascist named Guido Giannatini, who was associated with the third position. He was not only involved with the Piazza Fontana, but interestingly enough, he served as an agent, an arms distributor for the BND, the Galen organization, which was distributing arms to the Italian far right under the auspices of Merex, a company which we're going to touch on later in connection with names like Mansour el-Qassar, Abu Abbas, Oddfried Hepp, and that erstwhile American patriot Oliver North.
As a matter of fact, I'm just listening to this. We haven't talked about a lot of this stuff for a while. I think very quickly I'm going to run down a few of these names.
We better tell them what the P2 is,
we haven't
otherwise
talked
we'll
about
never get off the ground
Indeed.
tonight.
For those of you who know this stuff like the back of your respective hands, please bear with us. We'll try and make it quick. For those of you who have joined us fairly recently, we spent the best part of, 5 or 6 years talking about the P2. It's very familiar to many of us. The P2 is the Propaganda Due. That's the P2 is the way that you translate the initials in Italian. The Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge. It is not a Masonic lodge in the classic sense of a Mason's lodge. It was a front for a shadow government, so-called by its members and by the Italian authorities when it was discovered, a shadow fascist government of Italy. The Grand Master of the P2 Lodge was a well-connected fascist, a former Oberleutnant in the SS during World War II by the name of Licio Gelli. Licio Gelli also, besides being a prominent fascist and the head of the P2 Lodge, an extremely wealthy and well-connected man who walked in the highest circles of government and also in the lowest circles of scum and international riffraff.
He helped set up, incidentally, according to David Yallop and In God's Name, the Rat Line, which brought a lot of Nazi war criminals to Latin America and elsewhere in the New World to work for, among others, U.S. intelligence. One of the best ways to understand Licio Gelli is to understand his nickname, which in Italy, well, he has several of them, including Il Venerabile, the old respected one, I guess is how that would be translated. But his main nickname is the Puppet Master.
That's right. Now, Licio Gelli had his hands on a whole lot of puppets. On the one hand, as we talked about, he was walking in some very expensive and wealthy and important circles. We'll get back to that in a moment. Interestingly enough, when you start dealing with the fascist right and the international fascist right, it's interesting how the scum and the highly placed go hand in hand and often are in fact the same people. And Licio Gelli is certainly one of those real telltale folks who are walking both worlds at the same time. Now, Licio Gelli, on one hand, was apparently intimately connected to several people like Stefano Della Chiai, the worst kind of fascist, terrorist, thug, murderer, etc., and a variety of people through Stefano Della Chiai of various sorts affiliated with the extreme Italian right, the mob, murder gangs, kidnapping gangs, things of that nature. On the other hand, Licio Gelli was also, through the P2, intimately connected to people like the heads of military and intelligence in Italy, various government members, a lot of wealthy society people, and two wealthy society people in particular that are very interesting for our purposes, Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi. Michele Sindona we'll just touch on briefly. He was a prominent Italian fascist and also at the same time a prominent financier who both acted as the financial advisor for the Vatican Bank and at the same time for the American CIA and the Mafia, all at the same time. Roberto Calvi, another close friend of Licio Gelli, also a high-ranking P2 member. Roberto Calvi headed up the Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, the largest private bank in Italy. Through his P2 connections and also through Licio Gelli's and Sindona's and others' connections into the Vatican, Roberto Calvi used Vatican banking okays, or Vatican banking backing, to set up a bunch of dummy companies, dummy loans, use them to support fascist government in South America and make millions of dollars for himself and his friends, meanwhile bilking stockholders right and left. Roberto Calvi eventually met a very ugly death. Some people have suggested it was a suicide. Most sensible people know better. Roberto Calvi, as so many people in this case, like Michele Sindona later on, go to their grave bearing the secrets of this whole affair. Now, we've got the P2, We've got the Banco Ambrosiano, the largest private bank in Italy, which it became an absolute rotten, festering mass of plots, counterplots, financial schemes, fascist money laundering gimmicks, etc., etc. We also have a group called Stibom. Stibom, at the time of its being broken open, was the largest guns and drug running operation in the world.
And before we go to Stibom, I think it might help the transition to Stibom if we discuss the Red Brigades and Gelli's connection with them, and also the Super Sismi too. Now, one of the facets of P2's and again, we're talking about a Masonic lodge, which is actually anything but a Masonic lodge. It's a front. And it was a very powerful front, which in effect became literally a crypto-fascist government of Italy. It ran the show. One of the major ways in which it ran the show was by controlling a very, very important and overtly fascistic and conspiratorial group within the Italian military and intelligence services, in particular the intelligence service Sismi, S-I-S-M-I, a foreign intelligence service, which became known as the Super Sismi. It was very similar to what we saw in the Iran-Contra scandal with the Enterprise. It was an insiders group who were above the normal machinery of national policy and determining that policy from outside of the usual channels. And it is no coincidence at all that many of the conspiratorial forces within the Reagan White House over the years have direct connections to the Super Sismi. People like Francesco Pazienza and others of the Super Sismi, Michele Papa, who is affiliated with them, though not a member of them, have worked with the Reagan White House. And indeed, Licio Gelli, former Oberleutnant in the U.S., in the SS rather, was an honored guest at Ronald Reagan's inauguration. Now, one of the ways in which these Italian intelligence officials, this fascistic group within the Italian national security establishment, has maintained social and political control was by the systematic and deliberate use of both right and left-wing terrorism in something called the strategy of tension, named that by the aforementioned Stefano Della Chiai. This basically used terrorist incidents to keep the Italian political pot boiling, to keep people worked up. It basically is Schrecklichkeit. It's a fancy name for Schrecklichkeit, frightfulness, terrorism. By setting off bombs and blaming them, in particular blaming them on the left. The right would set off bombs and blame them on the left and commit assassinations and things of this type. The Italian electorate was driven to the right by this series of terrorist incidents. And one of the most interesting things about that terror is that the Italian Red Brigades, ostensibly communist terrorists, in fact turned out to have been founded in considerable measure by none other than P2 Grandmaster and former SS man, Licio Gelli. This was the conclusion of an Italian parliamentary commission headed up by Italian PM, Tina Anselmi, which specifically looked into the P2 and found that the P2 basically ran the Red Brigades. In a translation that we got courtesy of Jonathan Marshall and Ted Rubenstein some time ago, one of the members of the Super Sismi group, an Italian intelligencer named Pietro Musumeci, was basically running both right and left-wing terrorism. One terrorist was quoted as saying he was offered the opportunity to work for either the right or the left, and he chose the right because it was more familiar territory. Well, as we're going to see this evening, not all Italian fascists have made that same choice for that same reason.
Indeed, and one of the key things with the Red Brigades, as we've talked about in the past, is that with as bloody a political history as Italy has had in the past 40 years since World War II, the most famous and certainly the most effective of the Italian political murders was the murder of Prime Minister Aldo Moro, affected by the Red Brigades after a kidnapping, again at a time, as so often happens when you go back and look at the Red Brigades, at a time when the legitimate political left in Italy was making a bid to be allowed back into power again, something that the U.S. government and the right-wing elements within Italy have been fighting ever since World War II.
Well, the Super Sismi specifically was a group put together to guard against the possibility of a communist ascension to government. The Communist Party in Italy, by the way, is not only one of the largest and most powerful political parties, but is also, incidentally, one of the most respected political parties in all of Western Europe. A far cry from the usual view in this country of, a bunch of addle-brained, bomb-throwing crazies running around sloganeering and chanting about the dictatorship of the proletariat. Far from it. And Aldo Moro had offered for the first time formal effective participation by the Italian Communist Party as a main governing factor. Ask yourself what conceivable motive a leftist group would have for blowing away a man that would be taking steps like that.
That's right. But indeed, that's what happened. And as we look again, this is the strategy of tension. When you find out that the Red Brigades were founded by Licio Gelli and run by Super Sismi, then the fact of Aldo Moro's kidnapping and murder becomes a lot clearer. Now, at the same time we have these elements operating, we're going to touch briefly on two other elements. One of them is Stee-Bomb. Stee-Bomb we have to touch on briefly because it's so vast, but it was a huge guns and drugs operation.
And both Stee-Bomb and the Aldo Moro killing are not only going to be coming into play later in this broadcast, but are going to be hooking up later in this broadcast.
That's right. And Stee-Bomb, a vast guns and drugs smuggling operation that, of course, was used by, among other things, the P2 Lodge and Grandmaster Licio Gelli and others for a variety of reasons. The profits from Stee-Bomb were apparently laundered through the Banco Ambrosiano, among other things, and through other various financial things that the P2 people had access to. And, of course, the fact of having control of that kind of huge shipment of arms and drugs enabled them to do a lot of other things. One of the things it appears to have enabled them to do was attempt to bump off or at least send a very strong message to Pope John Paul II. And as the Bulgarian thesis put forward by the CIA and various CIA-related journalists was pulled apart, underneath the Bulgarian thesis, which was absolutely untenable in any sensible examination, underneath the Bulgarian thesis became very obvious the skeleton of the P2, and there is we spent again 5 or 6 years talking about this. We can't possibly do it in 10 minutes, but scads and scads of connections between the various P2 people, the Super Sismi people,
American intelligence, and members of the secret team, specifically Theodore Shackley, and also a fellow named Ruzi Nazarov, a former member of an SS punishment battalion who went to work for the CIA after the war and was apparently still maintained contacts not only with CIA but with Paul Henze, one of the first proponents of the Bulgarian thesis, and he was very close to Alparslan Turkes and the National Action Party, of which the Grey Wolves are the youth wing, very much like the Hitler Youth, and he was the representative for the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations at the Dallas Wackle Conference in 1985. Interestingly enough, the Pope shooting happened at a time when the Vatican and the Kremlin were reaching a diplomatic rapprochement. For all of their differences, they had found some common ground, namely not wanting Poland to be turned into a nuclear battlefield, not wanting the Middle East to be turned into a nuclear battlefield, and not wanting the whole Earth to be turned into a nuclear battlefield, none of which sat particularly well, apparently, with Messrs. Shackley and others.
Another thing, too, again, not to go into too great detail on the Pope shooting, but just to sum it up, again, something that, just to look at these facts, Mehmet Ali Agha was trained with a group of people who were trained by Frank Turpel, ex-CIA agent, quote-unquote ex-CIA agent, who also happened to be the CIA's man in Libya for some time. Mehmet Ali Agha was out of a group, the Grey Wolves, which were a fascist organization explicitly linked to European fascists, and specifically also to Stee-Bomb and the drug trade that was linked to the P2 later on. Mehmet Ali Agha's gun came from a man by the name of Horst Grillmeyer. Horst Grillmeyer himself an Austrian with connections to Stee-Bomb and other groups. And Mehmet Ali Agha's paymaster for the operation.
And Grillmeyer also had, perhaps most importantly, connections to the BND, which had brought in a weapon.
The West Germans equivalent of the CIA.
Which, again, is the final incarnation of Reinhard Gehlen's organization, which was the Nazi Eastern Front Intelligence Group from World War II.
And the paymaster for the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II was a man by the name of Bakir Celenk. Bakir Celenk just happened to be also somebody who was a member of Stee-Bomb, also a man himself connected to U.S. government intelligence, connected to various Italian fascist sources. So we've got the gun, the training, the assassin, and everything else coming from various fascist sources, all of them linked very tightly together through the Italian P2, and yet people are still trying to convince us that it was the Bulgarians. Well, folks, I think it's pretty obvious.
Nip, I'm going to turn the tape over here. If you want to talk to him for just a second, I'm going to give him some of the tape references for some of the RFA references for new listeners.
Absolutely. Go ahead. But when you have a group of 60 or 70 people sitting around planning day in, day out to launder money, to murder people, to make other people disappear, to lie to the press, to own the press in other cases, to assassinate world leaders, to topple governments.
To start wars, to smuggle 3 hydrogen bombs to Syria, which is not just hydrogen, but 20 megaton hydrogen bombs, which is one of the scams Stee-Bomb appeared to have been involved in.
That's right. And when you're doing all of this in a supposed Masonic lodge, and you're operating at the same time as you're having your supposed supposed lodge meetings, you're in contact with the representatives of several Western governments and the inner circle of Western intelligence. Well, folks, I don't know what you can call it if you can't call it a conspiracy, but whatever the hell it is, that's what was going on, and that's the stuff that we're updating on tonight.
You can call it your mother, but it's a conspiracy.
It's a conspiracy.
Now, one of the most interesting things, too, is that this is, for people that are new to this whole phenomenon is something we have been referring to for a long time as the Mediterranean merry-go-round, and I think as these connections begin to whirl by your ears, I think you'll begin to understand why we call it that. We also call it that because it keeps on going around and around. We haven't even begun to scratch the connections. The P2 Lodge literally had branches in a number of different countries. Brazil, Uruguay, Monte Carlo, among others. Very, very important organization. Argentina, very important branch in Argentina, affiliated with the junta there. This particular connection, the P2 connections go all over the place. They go to George Bush. Licio Gelli was described by another P2 member as having met him standing around in a group of U.S. military officers in the uniform of a United States Air Force general, and described himself as having been aided during his flight from justice, because he was a fugitive, by his good friend George Bush. And with the apparent connections of the P2 people to the 1980 election, which they helped swing for Ronald Reagan, people should not view this as something which is in any way remote from American politics. The Pope shooting was a tremendous propaganda coup, even though it was pure horse manure in terms of the factual representation. The fact of the matter is that a traditional block of the traditional Democratic Party, your inner city blue collar workers of Polish, Irish, Italian, Lithuanian extraction, were very, very alien. Well, they've been a number of things have been alienating them from traditional liberal politics, but that certainly helped make them absolutely rabid. That on top of the solidarity thing, and helped keep them solidly in the Reagan camp. Blue collar workers went for Reagan in '84,
and it worked. One last thing before Dave reads this article, though obviously we've given you a dizzying whirl, a merry-go-round, as we put it, of names and things. But the most important thing to hang on to tonight is to understand that this darkest possible side of our Western societies, this clot of darkness, that to be florid and dramatic about it, that was was made up by these various people in intelligence, military, and extremely wealthy branches of industry. That again, strangely enough, some of the best work that they got done was gotten done because of their affiliations with Middle Eastern terrorists and supposed or pseudo-leftist groups such as the Red Brigades and other, quote, communist terrorists. And these are the people who time and time again, and surely not by coincidence, after the number of times it happened, time and time again did exactly what benefited these particularly hideous group of Western intelligence-related fascists, again, with direct ties to the Italian government, the American government, all the way down the line. So what we've got, a group of government people, including our own government, getting their dirtiest work done by the use of Middle Eastern nationalist terrorists and European and American leftist terrorists.
Yeah, and again, one of the things to bear in mind here is that all of these groups, in turn, are very, very much taken with Ayatollah Khomeini and have demonstrable connections to the Islamic fundamentalist terrorist milieu that has been unleashed in Europe and the United States and the Middle East by the Ayatollah's gunsols. So that is perhaps the single most important thing. But again, Giovanni Maglioli, Franco Freda of the third position, both P2-related Italian fascists who were very much taken with Khomeini. Now remember, too, the Fighting Communist Party or Fighting Communist Proletariat, one of the groups also that apparently has linked up with the Iranian militants and their terrorist activities in Italy and elsewhere. Again, research credit for the following goes to Dave, who dug this up for us, too. Although this doesn't come from the Italian press, it does come from the Oakland Tribune of April 16th of 1988. This is a story by Terry Leonard of the Associated Press. Dateline Rome, and headlined, Italy's Red Brigades kill politician Ruffili, R-U-F-F-I-L-L-I. Senator Roberto Ruffili, a close friend and advisor of Premier Ciraccio Di Mita, was shot to death yesterday at his home in northern Italy. An anonymous caller said Red Brigade's terrorists were responsible. Investigators told Italian news agencies the body of the 51-year-old Christian Democrat senator was found on a couch in his living room at Forli, 40 miles southeast of Bologna. They said he was shot in the back of the neck. A spokesman for the Interior Ministry said an anonymous telephone caller to the Bologna office of the Rome newspaper La Repubblica asserted responsibility on behalf of the Red Brigades. The spokesman quoted the caller as saying, quote, "We have killed Senator Ruffili, attacking at the heart of the state. Red Brigades, for the formation of the Fighting Communist Party. That is the PCC we mentioned just in the article that Nip just read you. Skipping down on the article, Maurizio Laudi, a magistrate who has investigated the terrorist group, was quoted by the news agency AGI as saying the Red Brigades for the formation of the Fighting Communist Party is the most dangerous and active group in what remains of the Red Brigades. He said it also is the most difficult to penetrate. Interrupting, we may see, well, we have a hint as to why down a little later in the article. AGI said Ruffili had received threatening phone calls in recent days. He led the Christian Democrat Committee on Problems of the State and was working with the Premier on institutional reform. Ruffili was also on the parliamentary commission that investigated the P2 Masonic Lodge scandal. That last sentence perhaps should have been followed by the exclamatory phrase, surprise, surprise. The Red Brigades have a very interesting way of doing exactly the kinds of things that the P2, an ultra-right organization, would want them to do. And in fact, that should come as no surprise, since in fact, P2 Grandmaster Licio Gelli has, in considerable measure, been credited with founding the Red Brigades. And again, this Fighting Communist Party is the group that is hooked up with the Iranian militants. One thing I forgot to do a second ago was to cite some RFA tape references. If people want to catch up on this admittedly very complex tangle of events, Radio Free America shows 17 through 21 dealt specifically with the P2 and the Pope shooting. Then Radio Free America shows 32 and 34 brought in a number of very, very interesting connections, again, on the Mediterranean merry-go-round, which intersect the Iran-Contra scandal in a big way with the shooting of the Pope and the P2 lodge. The whole Valsella Mechanotechnica connection, the interesting budding Grey Wolf connections now in the pizza connection case, going to apparently, among others, George Bush and Donald Reagan, being some of the many connections between the Iran-Contra scandal and the P2 nexus.
All right, another article from the Tribune here.
Also researched by Dave, our Italian translator.
And also written by some folks whose work we have used many times on this show. The article is entitled The French Right's Alliance with Iran, and it's again from the Tribune for January 8th, 1988. The article is by Martin A. Lee and Kevin Coogan.
This particular article, too, sums up in considerable measure an excellent article, the cover story on Mother Jones from May of 1987. I can't believe it's already more than a year since that came out. But a marvelous cover story on it's called Europe's New Fascists. For those of you who'd like to go to a library that has Mother Jones, the cover story of May 1987 by Martin Lee and Kevin Coogan deals with Europe's new fascists and specifically some of the connections we're talking about here, and in particular the politics of the fascist third position. And that Mother Jones article is much of it is summed up in a neat sort of way in the article that Nip's about to read you.
Iranian official Wahid Gorgi, spelled Gordji, a prime suspect in a bloody bombing spree that rocked Paris in 1986, was recently permitted to return to his native land in exchange for the release of 2 French hostages held in Lebanon. While debate raged over whether French Prime Minister Jacques Chirac had capitulated to terrorists, an important aspect of the case has been overlooked: Iran's support for right-wing extremists in Europe. This surprising connection surfaced last summer when French officials discovered a check written by Gorgi for 120,000 francs, about $20,000, to Ogmios, a neo-Nazi bookstore and publisher in Paris. The money was used to finance a slick 48-page catalog promoting, quote, the myth of the Jewish Holocaust and other unsavory tracts. Gorgi also arranged for 2 Ogmios members to accompany Alain de Benoist, France's leading New Right intellectual, on an Iranian-funded junket to the front lines of the war with Iraq. Gorgi first caught the eye of French authorities when an informer's tip led to a wiretap of an Islamic bookstore in a Paris suburb frequented by a group of Arabs who were subsequently arrested for the 1986 bombings that killed 13 people and injured hundreds. French intelligence pegged Gorgi, a close friend of the bookstore owner, as the mastermind of the terrorist attacks. Investigating magistrate Gilles Bouloc's attempts to interrogate Gorgi provoked a break in diplomatic relations between France and Iran last July. When Gorgi took refuge in Iran's Paris embassy, police cordoned off the building. The Iranians retaliated by surrounding the French embassy in Tehran, and a 6-month standoff ensued. The case became even more intriguing when Le Monde disclosed Gorgi's ties with Francois Genoud, a mysterious Swiss banker and Hitler worshipper.
And that, by the way, is a name to store away in a big way for later.
That's right, and it's spelled Genoud. We hear about Francois pretty often these days. Genoud is also a bibliophile of sorts. He holds the posthumous rights to the writings of Hitler, Bormann, and Goebbels. Genoud's most recent preoccupations, however, have been legal rather than literary. He helped finance the defense of Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Barbie's attorney, a flamboyant ultra-leftist, I'll read that again because we want to put that in quotes, a flamboyant ultra-leftist named Jacques Verges had worked with Genoud for many years. Verges, in turn, became the lawyer for the, quote, friends of Wahid Gorgi in negotiations with the French government. Verges had previously represented Georges Ibrahim Abdallah, the Lebanese terrorist now serving a life sentence for murdering a U.S. military attaché and an Israeli diplomat. Last year's bombings in Paris were unleashed in an effort to secure Abdallah's freedom. The Gorgi affair is all the more disturbing in light of ongoing far-right overtures to Iran. In England, for example, leaders of the National Front, the country's most violent fascist organization, openly sing the praises of racial and cultural, quote, nationalists such as Louis Farrakhan, Muammar Gaddafi, and the Ayatollah Khomeini.
Nip, not to be corny, but you might want to read that last sentence, or repeat that last sentence again, because that's relevant to a few
talking about
things.
Those names pretty frequently, haven't we? The example in England, for example, leaders of the National Front, the country's most violent fascist organization, openly sing the praises of racial and cultural nationalists, quote unquote, such as Louis Farrakhan. That's right, Louis Farrakhan from the mosque in Chicago.
Also affiliated with the Aryan nations from time to time.
That's right.
Which now perhaps does not seem as surprising as it might have when we first discussed it.
No, Louis Farrakhan, Muammar Gaddafi, and the Ayatollah Khomeini. National Front members have reportedly spied on Iranian dissidents in England for the Khomeini regime. One National Front publication effused about Khomeini's Islamic Revolutionary Guards, quote, their belief in their cause is so strong that they will run through minefields unarmed to attack enemy positions. Their ideals are so all-consuming that they will drive truck bombs into enemy camps knowing full well their death is inevitable. This power, this contempt for death is the stuff of which victories are made, unquote. This may seem rather bizarre, given that Farrakhan, Gaddafi, and Khomeini are, by culture and skin coloring, exactly the type of people that British Paki bashers, quote-unquote, and the French New Right want to ban from their countries. But Iranian fundamentalists and neo-Nazi fanatics are united, not only in their intense anti-Semitism, but also in the belief that there must be no, quote, cosmopolitan race mixing, unquote. Both agree that Europe and Islam should remain separate cultures free from the decadent influence of the two superpowers. A recent study by the European Parliament warned of an alarming growth throughout the continent of racist and xenophobic attitudes that, quote, create a fertile breeding ground for right-wing extremism. With the emergence of Jean-Marie Le Pen as a significant political force in France, the extreme right can no longer be dismissed as a fringe movement. Le Pen, a notorious Arab hater, caused a stir when he suggested that historians may have exaggerated the Holocaust. While ominous in and of itself, the rise of the radical right in Europe may pose an even greater danger if its hate propaganda and terror is covertly subsidized by governments like Iran. Wahid Gorgi certainly could have shed some light on this unholy alliance, but those who wish to interrogate him will now have to put their questions in a letter addressed to Gorgi's new residence in Tehran.
One of the interesting things about that article, again, when in describing the affinity of the third position fascists for people like Gaddafi, who we can understand, Khomeini, who we're beginning to understand, and Louis Farrakhan, one of the things we should take a look at historically, and one of the analogies that we've talked about in the past, is what I at least feel is a very close analogy between the functioning of the Nation of Islam in contemporary America and the Beitarim or revisionist Zionists in Europe. In Europe, one of the things that has been forgotten by most people concerning the history of the Second World War and the Third Reich was that there was a community of interests between, for a while, the SS and overtly Zionist elements, specifically the Haganah. The SS, before the final solution to the Jewish problem, was actively promoting Jewish emigration to Palestine as a means of getting Europe, quote, Judenrein, and Jew-free. And by the same token, before the final solution, the fascist Zionists, the Beitarim, a group of Jews who were explicitly fascist in their outlook, formed a political alliance with the SS because they, for a while, were working for the same thing, at least up to a point, namely to get Jews out of Europe and into Palestine. It is this racial separatism that forms one of the main points of common ground between the third position fascists and people like Khomeini and Gaddafi and Louis Farrakhan. And just as George Lincoln Rockwell was able to find common ground with Elijah Muhammad, just as I've forgotten his first name. His last name is Miles. Just as this fellow Miles, who's a Michigan Klansman and Aryan Nations member, and I've forgotten his first name off the top of my head, but he was hooked up with Louis Farrakhan, and Farrakhan attended, or representatives of his attended an Aryan Nations meeting. This is the same kind of an alliance. The Beitarim were explicitly fascist Jews. They were really two groups. They were the Beitar, headed up by a guy named Vladimir Jabotinsky, who openly espoused the Mussolini line of fascism, trained with Mussolini's naval cadets, and were actually reviewed by Il Duce. And they made it very clear in an article in L'Idea Zionistica, the Italian Zionist newspaper, that this was not just a pragmatic alliance to gain Il Duce's assistance, but that they actually believed in the same things. Then there was also the Stern Gang, an even farther right group of explicitly Nazi-oriented Jews, headed up by Yitzhak Shamir, Menachem Begin being the key figure in the Beitar that has survived to us from the Beitar period. Again, the point being that I think people should think very carefully whether Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam really have the best interests of black people at heart, and my feeling is that they are in exactly the same kind of a situation that Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir were vis-a-vis the Third Reich for a while. And it's also interesting that recent weeks we've spoken about the Nation of Islam's participation in the Tawana Brawley affair with Reverend Al Sharpton of FBI and probably CIA fame as well. It's interesting to contemplate the Nation of Islam basically as a bunch of pot boilers in this country. Sharpton, incidentally, was reported by Warren Hinkle of the New York Times, or of the San Francisco Chronicle, to have probably been involved in, among other things, CIA activities in Grenada. And it's very interesting. It doesn't take much imagination to see him stirring the pot beneath Maurice Bishop in much the way that he appears to be stirring the pot under the Democratic political leadership of New York State and the New York State legal system at this time, and thereby discrediting black politics in the eyes of many people, white and black, in that area. I can easily see Al Sharpton telling people that, well, Maurice Bishop and his people just didn't have the true revolutionary interests at heart, and if they really wanted to do it, they ought to get this fellow Austin and some others and back him up and overthrow Maurice Bishop. Doesn't take much imagination at all, particularly in light of the fact that we had Frank Turple on Grenada at much that same period of time.
What it all boils down to, and we're going to be taking a break first, and we're going to be taking a break first, and then we're going to be listening to a tape. But what it all boils down to, we're talking about two separate things, as it appears. They're being presented to us that way, but again, we're being manipulated. We're seeing two different puppets, but we're not seeing the puppet master behind the black cloak. We're just seeing the two puppets, the right hand and the left hand, sticking up over the top. We're reacting as if those are real people. They're not. They're connected. They're connected down below, out of sight. You can call it a conspiracy if you want to. You can call it anything you want to. But it's manipulation, and it works.
And again, the phrase community of interest. There are long-standing affiliations between elements of Nazism and Middle Eastern nationalism, both Palestinian and Iranian. The Shah and his father, the first Shah, had overt Nazi sympathies and were removed by the British from power temporarily for those same reasons. In fact, the Shah's title in Farsi was Shah an Shah Ari Amer, Shah of Shahs, Light of the Aryans. This whole thing goes back quite a long ways. When Mossadegh was overthrown, he was replaced by a fellow named Fazola Zahedi, a former Nazi intelligence official, or agent, I should say, whose son, Ardashir Zahedi, became the ambassador to the U.S. So these connections go back a long way. And I was
going to say, we've talked about old Pierre Gemayel and the Gemayel family, who have been running the Phalangist Party for years. Well, that's where the Phalangism comes from. Phalangism comes from fascism, from the Phalanges, and it runs around, folks. It's not a new connection, and it's not a new way for people to be confused as to who's who.
And again, I think one of the things to bear in mind here is the phrase community of interests. Think about how the Nazis benefit from having a bunch of wild-eyed Palestinian Iranian terrorists running around throwing bombs. That way they can point to the quote sand niggers unquote and the quote diaper heads unquote and stir the political pot for their own benefit on the right, a la Jean-Marie Le Pen. And think about the Ayatollah. And think about how, again, the domestic bankruptcy of the policies of the Ayatollah, who's turned Iran into a wasteland, and Ronald Reagan, who totally bankrupted America, this fiscal conservative, in 8 years. And think about the extent to which each of them depend for their political careers on political capital generated by the perceived outrages of the other.
While you're thinking about that, we're going to take a break. We'll be back in just a few minutes with more One Step Beyond right here on KFJC. We are in the studios at KFJC, and we have been talking about a number of things tonight. By the way, of course, that was the Firesign Theater with fighting clowns, and a little bit from that
called In the War Zone.
In the War Zone, very appropriate. And, of course, everybody recognized that gravelly, whining voice as Robert Zimmerman from Hibbing, Minnesota, with God on our side. And what we're talking about tonight is who is exactly on which side. Are they the left? Are they the right? Are they both, and how does that affect us? And in fact, with the Iranian airline disaster, or the shooting down of the Iranian airline, which we didn't really talk about tonight except in passing, in the news, and the war zone being just that, a war zone in the Middle East, it's time to reflect on a little bit on who exactly is pulling our strings and what do they have in mind for us.
Yeah, now this evening, again, we're talking about the Fascist Third Position, the first of a couple of programs, and tonight's broadcast, by the way, is going to go into the archives. We're now going to dip back into the archives for some background information. Now, in the article by Kevin Coogan and Marty Lee, a couple of brilliant researchers whose work we're going to be touching on again in this this two-part series on the Fascist Third Position, may even go, ultimately, it may hook up with old Noam Chomsky, but in that article from the Oakland Tribune by Marty Lee and Kevin Coogan, the connections between the European right, specifically French fascists and Francois Genoud, an old Nazi intelligencer and Swiss Nazi banker, and the Iranian Islamic militants and elements of left terrorism in general, is front and center. We're now going to dip into a book called Unhealed Wounds by Erna Paris, and we're going to talk about a number, well, I should say you're going to hear on tape, a number of different connections, again, by way of illustrating further the intersection between European fascists, the community of interests, if you will, between European fascists and Middle Eastern terrorists of both Iranian and Palestinian stripes, and European, quote, leftist terrorists, unquote, because in actuality they appear to be more right, acting under left cover than left themselves, but there are certainly plenty of fanatics. And we're going to talk about the intersection between people like Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Galen group that went over to the Middle East under Alan Dulles, Francois Genoud, Jacques Verges, Klaus Barbie, a fellow named Otfried Hepp, Abu Abbas, and a whole lot of other superstars from Terrorfest 88. And this program, by the way, this tape segment that you're going to be hearing, is a supplement to Radio Free America number 22 that is on permanent file at Archives on Audio, and obviously this will be included in the broadcast this evening. So here is a segment from the supplement to Radio Free America number 22.
Now, this first half hour to 45 minutes or so this evening is going to consist of some excerpts from a book, a currently available book called Unhealed Wounds, subtitled France and the Klaus Barbie Affair. That's authored by Erna Paris, first name E-R-N-A, last name Paris, just as in Paris, France. The book was published in softcover in 1986 by the Grove Press Incorporated, New York. And it's copyright 1985, published in softcover by the Grove Press, New York. Now, recapping very briefly of some of the main information from Radio Free America number 22, we began that broadcast by Radio Free America number 22 by dealing with some interesting elements of the U.S. of the Olympics massacre that occurred in Munich, Germany in 1972. Specifically, we talked about some elements of that unfortunate event which are not generally well known. Specifically, we took a look at the man generally credited with planning and leading that attack, a man named Ali Hassan Salameh. We took a look at the fact that almost a year, within just under a year after leading the Olympics massacre, Ali Hassan Salameh was working for the Central Intelligence Agency in an anti-terrorist capacity, supposedly anyway. We also took a look at the fact that the Galen agent, the BND agent who was in charge of security for the U.S. Olympics, for the Olympics massacre in 1972, a man named Hans Langemann, was working setting up agent provocateur groups with a former head of the West German Federal Police named Hans Kollmar, last name Kollmar. Langemann, by the way, is Langemann. And Ali Hassan Salameh, Alihassan Salameh is the spelling on that. We also took a look at, in Radio Free America number 22, at a degree of historical continuity between elements of the Palestinian movement which had been affiliated with the Third Reich even before the Second World War, and we traced some of these elements up through the Palestinian terrorist movement and through the Olympics massacre of 1972. That's not to say that by any means all Palestinians or all elements of the PLO are terrorists or connected with the Nazi underground or the U.S. and Western intelligence apparatus, but many elements of them are. It's worth noting in this context that the PLO is a very diverse organization, highly fractionalized, and in fact many of the elements are at bitter odds with each other. Elements of that, of the PLO are affiliated, however, with the U.S. intelligence system, and in turn, the U.S. intelligence system has acquired many of these elements from many of the elements of the Palestinian movement that had been traditionally associated with the Third Reich. Now, Ali Hassan Salameh, the fellow who led the Olympics massacre, was associated with George Habash's PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the same fellow who went to work for the CIA has been associated through his family with a man named Hajamin al-Husseini. Hajamin al-Husseini, who we're going to talk about some more this evening, was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and later he went to work for the Third Reich as a major in the SS. Among the people who worked very closely with Hajamin al-Husseini was Hassan Salameh. Hassan Salameh is the father of Ali Hassan Salameh, the leader of the Olympics massacre. Hassan Salameh worked as a commando during the Third Reich, and then fought along with Hajamin al-Husseini against Israel following the establishment of the State of Israel. Later, Ali Hassan Salameh, his son, married a woman from the family of Hajamin al-Husseini, the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, spiritual leader of all Palestinian Muslims for a time, and eventually, as we indicated, a major in the SS. As I also indicated, the chief of security for the Olympics massacre, Hans Langemann, a member of the Galen organization, the Nazi Eastern Front intelligence outfit which jumped to the CIA at the end of World War II, began working later with Hans Kollmar, head of the Bundeskriminalamt, the West German Federal Police, as setting up basically what appeared to have been agent provocateur groups. He was setting up terrorist groups ostensibly for the purpose of infiltrating terrorist groups in Germany. Indications were, however, that this group, supposedly to infiltrate terrorists, had in fact established terrorist incidents themselves. We're going to begin picking up sort of where we left off at that time, and we're going to take a look at some interesting connecting elements between the post-World War II Nazi underground, some Nazi intelligence operations which were run out of the Galen organization, the Nazi spy outfit that jumped to the CIA at the end of World War II, and we're going to connect many of these elements up with not only Palestinian terrorism, but with terrorism in general, and terrorism going on to this very day, some elements which are active to the moment. We're going to begin by taking a look at two individuals named Jacques Verges, last name Verges, Jacques, is how his first name is spelled, and also a very, very important man named Francois Genoud, Genoud is his last name. Of course, Francois is Francois. Now, reading now from the book Unhealed Wounds by Irna Paris. We're going to begin by taking a look at Jacques Verges and his relationship with Francois Genoud, and we're going to begin taking a look also at just who Francois Genoud is. Reading from Unhealed Wounds by Irna Paris. It was June 15th, 1983. Jacques Verges had become Klaus Barbie's sole legal counsel. Interrupting, of course, Klaus Barbie was the SS captain from Lyon and later U.S. intelligence agent who was extradited to France in early 1983. Continuing. Verges merely smiled mysteriously when asked who was paying his fees and his expenses for trips to faraway places like La Paz, Bolivia, to collect evidence and interview witnesses. Francois Genoud, on the other hand, was slightly less reticent. In an interview with Stern magazine, he said that he would, quote, neither confirm nor deny, unquote, his involvement in the Barbie affair, adding that, quote, everyone has his hobbies, unquote. Among Verges' acquaintances, however, the answer seemed evident. Quote, if Jacques needs money these days, he has only to go to Switzerland, confided a friend. It has long been known in various European circles that, quote, a Swiss citizen who lives in Lausanne, Lausanne, has managed the Nazi treasury since the fall of the Third Reich. The money, most of which was stolen from European Jews, was deposited in numbered bank accounts through a clandestine club of former SS officers called Die Spinne, the Spider, the successor to the Odessa organization. In March of 1965, Le Monde indirectly identified this individual as Francois Genoud. In 1969, the Centre d'Information et de Documentation Moyen-Orient in Brussels confirmed the identification. By the way, that would be the Center of Information and Documentation for the Middle East, translating from the French. Recapping the important aspect of the last section, Francois Genoud basically was the person who has controlled from Swiss bank accounts the post-World War II Nazi treasury. The Nazis had anticipated their defeat long before the end of the war and stashed away a great deal of capital for the financing of post-war Nazi activities, something which has sort of unfortunately been relegated to the realm of pulp fiction, but which is in fact a very real and current reality. Continuing with Unhealed Wounds, Francois Genoud personifies a hybrid of ultra-left and neo-Nazi extremism that first appeared on the international scene after the last war. One might even say he created the type along with a handful of others. His Nazism came first. Genoud was born in Lausanne in 1915 into a bourgeois family that appreciated law and order, unquote. In the early 1930s, before Hitler came to power, his parents sent him to Germany in the hope that he would pick up some of the discipline of the emerging new regime. During his stay, Genoud was introduced to Hitler and actually shook his hand. He read Hitler's writings and found them very relevant, unquote. The teenager was an instant convert. Francois Genoud returned to Switzerland a convinced Nazi, and he has never lost his faith. Back in Switzerland, Genoud made contact with Georges Oltremare, O-L-T-R-A-M-A-R-E, the head of the Swiss fascist party, l'Union Nationale. According to his own account, however, Genoud preferred the pro-Nazi Front National, which he joined in 1934. In 1936, he traveled to Palestine, where he met an individual who, like himself, would eventually combine the presumably polar opposites of fascism and extreme left-wing nationalism. Haj Amin al-Hussein was the ex-Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and he was to become one of Genoud's links to the Arab world. In 1940, the military attaché at the French embassy in Bern, Switzerland, noted that Genoud was involved in disseminating anti-French propaganda. Also around this time, Genoud was contacted by an agent of the Abwehr. By the way, that was the German military intelligence service during World War II. Beginning again, also around this time, Genoud was contacted by an agent of the Abwehr for work in the German intelligence service. And during the course of the year, he disappeared from Switzerland to travel through Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Belgium. During this period, and immediately following the end of the war, Genoud made the acquaintance of several extremely prominent Nazis, including SS General Karl Wolff, W-O-L-F-F. Wolff was Himmler's personal adjutant as far back as 1933, and in 1939, he became Hitler's liaison officer in the Führer's headquarters. In 1943, Wolff was Supreme SS and police leader in the Italian campaign, and it was he who negotiated surrender on April 29, 1945. He was also part of Hitler's plan, later abandoned, to kidnap Pope Pius XII in September of 1943, after the fall of Mussolini, with a special regiment of 2,000 men. Wolff was a consummate Nazi. According to a document submitted to the court at Nuremberg in 1946, he had greeted, quote, with particular joy, unquote, the information that for 2 weeks now a train has been carrying every day 5,000 members of the chosen people from Warsaw to the killing center at Treblinka. In 1984, just before his death at the age of 84, Wolff gave an interview to a Swiss journalist in which he spoke of how much former Nazis everywhere owed to Francois Genoud. After the war, while they were in prison or in hiding, Genoud acted as an intermediary, Wolf said. In particular, he was involved in bringing aid to German soldiers and officers who were being held in French prisons. Genoud claims that he was not involved in helping Nazis escape from Europe, but only, quote, because the occasion did not present itself, unquote. On another occasion, he explained himself further, this time with regard to Klaus Barbie. I did not help Mr. Barbie escape, he declared. It would not have been a dishonor to help National Socialists flee, but as it happens, I did not, unquote. As part of his ongoing commitment to the ideology of the Third Reich, Genoud became a publisher of important Nazi materials. He holds all posthumous rights to the writings of Hitler, Martin Bormann, and the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, according to a financial agreement concluded with members of all three families in 1945 and 6. In 1952, representing himself as an agent of the Hitler family, Genoud brought charges against a Paris publishing house that had produced Bormann's account of Hitler's conversations without his permission and won. And in 1956, a court in Cologne agreed that he owned the rights to the posthumous works of Goebbels, causing a scandal among people who claimed that the royalties from such writings ought to be in the public domain to compensate Hitler's victims. In 1973, Genoud sold the rights to the Goebbels diary, a 16,000-page manuscript with a Baroque history of its own, to Albrecht Naus, last name K-N-A-U-S, the director of Hoffmann und Kamp Verlag, a Hamburg publishing house, and in 1981 Naus, who by then had his own publishing house in Hamburg, brought out Hitler's Political Testament, as purportedly dictated to Martin Bormann. The preface to the book explained that Genoud had acquired the document in 1946 at the time of the Nuremberg trials. It seems that ex-SS Captain Hans Reichenberg, R-E-I-C-H-E-N-B-E-R-G, who had the document, went to the Nuremberg trials to act as an advisor for the defense. There, through his former superior, General Hermann Ramke, R-A-M-C-K-E, he met Francois Genoud, a friend of Ramke. During the course of a developing friendship, he confided to Genoud his photocopies of 18 chapters of the book. By 1955, Genoud's second career as advisor, researcher, and banker to the cause of Arab nationalism had begun. One of the keys to that seemingly unlikely transition can be found in Hitler's Political Testament. In the preface, Genoud explained that he planned to have the book translated into Arabic and Swahili because in the body of the text, Hitler invited the people of the Third World to carry on the work of the 1,000-year Reich. Let me repeat that last sentence. In the preface, Genoud explained that he planned to have the book translated into Arabic and Swahili because in the body of the text, Hitler invited the people of the Third World to carry on the work of the 1,000-year Reich. In 1955, Genoud was in Tangiers, one of the ports where Nazis seeking to escape European justice took refuge. He was also frequently in Cairo, where he worked in the Egyptian intelligence service under Nasser. Cairo under Nasser had been the center of the pan-Arab movement since 1945. These were important years, the years in which Nazism and the developing ultra-left began to merge, and Francois Genoud was at the center of events. With his friend Hans Reichenberg, who also had discovered a new outlet for his career in the Arab world, Genoud created an import-export company called Arobo Africa, as A-R-A-B-O and Africa A-F-R-I-K-A. The business was primarily a cover for the export of anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli propaganda and the delivery of weapons to the Algerian FLN movement. Genoud made financial investments for various friends, Hans Reichenberg and Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, S-C-H-A-C-H-T, Hitler's finance minister, among them. Genoud also renewed his friendship with Karl Wolff, who had found his way to Nasser's Egypt. Cairo in the 1950s was paradise for Nazis with nowhere to go and nowhere to apply their carefully honed talents. In the emerging world of Arab nationalism, they found a new outlet for their profound anti-Semitism and their propaganda skills. It was in this milieu that Francois Genoud first met the 9 leaders of the nascent Algerian insurrection. Ahmed Ben Bella, Mohammed Khider, K-H-I-D-E-R, Ait Ahmet, A-I-T-A-H-M-E-T, Mohammed Boudiaf, B-O-U-D-I-A-F, and their colleagues had formed the Provisional Government of Algeria. Genoud's skills as a financier made him infinitely valuable, and before the end of the decade he had established bank accounts in Switzerland on behalf of the North African Liberation Armies of Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. The system he used involved multiple signatures, just like the system that was already in use for secret Nazi funds. Let's go back and recap some of the important aspects of this particular passage. First of all, Francois Genoud was reportedly the fellow, and there's a lot of information to support this, who had been providing much of the financing for Jacques Verges, the lawyer, the defense attorney for Klaus Barbie in his impending trial in France. As we've seen, Francois Genoud was an avid Nazi, worked very closely with Nazi intelligence before and during World War II. After the war, he not only became the heir to a great many Nazi documents, such as Hitler's political testament, he also, and perhaps more importantly, became the key Nazi banker, that is, the man controlling and dispersing the massive funds secreted away by the Nazis during the course of World War II in anticipation of their impending defeat. We've also taken a look at how, prior to the war, Francois Genoud became acquainted with Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and SS officer who figures so prominently in the milieu that emerges in connection with the Olympics massacre. We've also taken a look at how Francois Genoud traveled to the Middle East and was very active in Egypt and worked in the Egyptian intelligence service, and became a key financier also for the emerging Arab nationalist movement. Now, this is a very key connection because, as we looked at in Radio Free America number 22, our program about the Olympics massacre, the Egyptian intelligence service, as did the Libyan intelligence service after it, had its origins with a group of Nazi war criminals dispatched for the express purpose of forming these intelligence services, and that those Nazi war criminals were acting on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency. Specifically, Nasser had requested help from the CIA in forming not only his general staff, but his intelligence service. Since the CIA had connections with Israel, did not want to alienate Israel by sending any of their regular agents, they turned to Galen, who dispatched a bunch of Nazi war criminals, most of them virulent anti-Semites. This group put together the Egyptian intelligence service, and later the Libyan intelligence service. That group was headed up by Otto Skorzeny, a major in the SS, actually a colonel in the SS, and a fellow who was basically in charge of commando training for the Third Reich. Skorzeny, in many ways, could be said to be the grandfather or the godfather of modern terrorism. Skorzeny ultimately, or at least nominally, was headed up all commando training for the Third Reich, as I said, and in that capacity, at least in terms of chain of command, had to have had Hassan Salameh under his command. Hassan Salameh had worked in an abortive commando mission to establish an Arab uprising in then British-held Palestine as a way to siphon off British strength from the impending Nazi offensive in the Battle of the Bulge, or what became the Battle of the Bulge once the engagement began. It's interesting that Francois Genoud was working for this Nazi intelligence group because, as we looked at in a book called Skorzeny, Hitler's Commando by Glenn Infield, it was while heading up this Nazi intelligence group in Egypt that Otto Skorzeny set up the first Palestinian commando groups which operated in the Gaza Strip. The first Palestinian terrorists were set up by Otto Skorzeny, according to Infield, while working on behalf of CIA and Galen in this area. So we have Francois Genoud hooking up with this milieu right at this point. We'll take a short break, and then we'll continue with the information we're presenting. Free America number 22, reading from Unhealed Wounds by Erna Paris. The next piece of information we're going to take a look at concerns the first conference of Third World Nations in Bandung, Indonesia. That's B-A-N-D-U-N-G. We're going to pick up the story, the thread of this historical connection that we're looking at that point. Reading once again from Unhealed Wounds by Erna Paris. In 1939, Amin al-Hussein, the ex-Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, took refuge from the British, escaped to Germany, and attached himself and his followers to the Nazi cause. Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief, was delighted. It wasn't every day that a regiment of sympathetic Muslims joined the German war movement. Himmler respected the Mufti and often complimented him on his blue eyes, which he liked to describe as appropriately Nordic. But it was in a written note to the Mufti that Himmler eventually struck a chord that would resound as a leitmotif for the future and survive 4 decades to influence the context of the Klaus Barbie affair. Quote, "The struggle against Judaism is at the very heart of the natural alliance between National Socialism and those Arab Muslims who burn with a desire for freedom," he wrote. "This alliance will endure until a final victory," unquote. In 1955, the Mufti resurfaced at the seminal conference at Bandung, Indonesia, where the idea of the Third World first took hold. 29 countries from Africa and Asia, representing more than one-half of the world's population, sent delegates to discuss common problems with an emphasis on colonialism. Among the Arab countries, however, hatred of Israel quickly emerged as a common theme. The representative from Iraq spoke of, quote, the force of evil, unquote, and called Zionism, quote, one of the blackest, most somber chapters in human history, unquote. Nasser had a few choice words to say in a similar vein, but the most surprising and convincing polemic of all came from Amin al-Hussein, who arrived on a surprise visit as the representative of Yemen, a country he had apparently never seen, and proceeded to reveal... One second, I've got to skip past the plates here. Proceeded to reveal to the collected constituents that the real ambition of Israel was to annex the entire Middle East. The significance here, of course, in light particularly of, according to Francois Genoud, Hitler's desire that the Third World should carry on his struggle against Judaism, is that the former SS man, Haj Amin al-Husseini, should emerge in a key capacity at the Seminole Conference forming the notion of the Third World, or the concept and functioning milieu of the Third World. So we have Haj Amin al-Husseini, an associate of Francois Genoud, at the Bandung Conference and apparently functioning in a key capacity. And apparently also, the Grand Mufti in the next section of Unhealed Wounds that we're going to look at was instrumental in drawing much of the post-World War II neo-Nazi movement and some of the surviving Third Reich veterans into an alliance with elements of the Palestinian movement against Israel. Returning to Unhealed Wounds. In April of 1969, a Congress of the neo-Nazi Neuropanische Ordnung was held in Barcelona with 50 delegates from Europe and Latin America, most of them former SS officers, nostalgic Vichyists, and Franco supporters. The Vichy French, of course, were the French fascists who governed on behalf of the Nazis in France. The new European order had been a strictly Nazi-oriented outfit, but now, 15 years later, the focus of their international meeting was the Palestinians. Yasser Arafat sent a representative from El Fatah to explain the needs of the PLO and present two requests. The first concerned the need to recruit non-Arabs for sabotage operations, fundraising, arms supply, and the mobilizing of mercenaries and foreign instructors for training camps. The second request was for money for the dissemination of anti-Zionist propaganda in Europe and South America, including a wider distribution of the protocols. The El Fatah representative convinced several former Nazis to work directly for the cause. Karl van de Putte, V-A-N-D-E, capital P-U-T, a Belgian who had served Germany in the Africa Corps, offered to recruit young Europeans with military experience for El Fatah. Former Nazi officer Johann N. Schuller, S-C-H-U-L-L-E-R, was already involved in arms sales to El Fatah. He had also begun to recruit former Nazi officers as instructors in El Fatah guerrilla training camps. Even the ubiquitous ex-Grand Mufti of Jerusalem turned up in discussion. It was announced that he had recently formed a new unit of sabotage. Palestinian leaders began advertising in the National Zeitung in Munich, asking for volunteer war correspondents, unquote, with tank experience, unquote, to fight Zionist imperialism. By the late 1960s, satellite television was able to transmit events all over the globe, rendering the possibilities for propaganda almost limitless. Quote, "We think that killing one Jew far from the field of battle is far more effective than killing 100 Jews on the field of battle because it attracts more attention," unquote, Dr. Habash confided several years later in an interview with Oriana Fallaci. By that, Dr. Habash, by the way, is George Habash, the head of the Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Popular Front, the PFLP. It is worth noting that he spoke of Jews, unquote, and not Zionists, unquote, as the target of terrorism. Before 1970, his PFLP had hijacked several foreign planes in full view of an international audience and blown up 4, killing Jews and Gentiles alike. Next, we're going to move on to some of the direct connections between Jacques Verges, Francois Genoud, Verges, the radical lawyer who also has strong connections to the Palestinian movement, who is defending, apparently, Klaus Barbie. Francois Genoud, of course, the Nazi sympathizer and pre, during, and post-World War II Nazi activist, and the man who controls not only the post-World War II Nazi treasury, according to this book, but also was instrumental in funding and handling the financing for the international Palestinian movement and Palestinian terrorism in particular. A reporter from Haaretz, this is when Jacques Verges was in Israel. Actually, I'm going to skip down in this section. This is incorrectly marked here. Returning once again to Unhealed Wounds. In December of 1968 and February of 1969, PFLP terrorists hijacked El Al planes in Athens and Zurich, respectively, and at their subsequent trial in Winterthur, Switzerland, they chose Jacques Verges as their legal counsel. Although he was once again refused permission to participate, Verges went anyway as an advisor. Also present as an advisor, unquote, was Francois Genoud. The possibilities for propaganda at the Winterthur trial, by the way, Winterthur is Winterthur, beginning again, the possibilities for propaganda at the Winterthur trial were too important to be left to amateurs. There were international press conferences, and an anti-Zionist brochure called The White Book was widely circulated. The defense was paid by the Banque Commerciale Arabe, which had by then adopted the Palestinians primarily on the recommendation of Ali Hassan Salameh, otherwise known as Abu Hassan, the leader of the Black September terrorist cell that was later responsible for the murder of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Abu Hassan lived in Switzerland, where he had established an easy friendship with Francois Genoud. I'm going to read that last couple of sentences again because it's key and it ties in many of the elements that we're discussing this evening with the gut information from Radio Free America 22. The defense was paid by the Banque Commerciale Arabe, which had by then adopted the Palestinians primarily on the recommendation of Ali Hassan Salameh, otherwise known as Abu Hassan, the leader of the Black September terrorist cell that was later responsible for the murder of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. Abu Hassan lived in Switzerland, where he had established an easy friendship with Francois Genoud. In 1982, Genoud publicly acknowledged his deep involvement with El Fatah. In fact, he had long looked after their European operations from every point of view. He gave advice regarding the investing of huge amounts of money donated to the cause, not least from Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who contributed $50 million to the PLO after the Munich assassinations. He provided legal counsel for Fatah men who needed help in Switzerland and underwrote other costs, including at least a partial subsidizing of a multinational terrorist organization that had set up shop in Paris, first under the leadership of Mohammed Boudia, who was murdered by the Israeli Secret Service in 1973, then under Carlos the Jackal. He was, in his own words, quote, an economic counselor with a special interest in the developmental problems of the Third World, unquote. Indeed, his interest in developmental problems, unquote, led him to continue his business dealings as an arms merchant specializing in sales to the Palestinians. Well, of course, the significance of these passages, we not only have Jacques Verges and Francois Genoud connected up with the PFLP, a group with which Ali Hassan Salameh was also affiliated, but we have direct connections here between Ali Hassan Salameh, the leader of the Olympics massacre, son of a Nazi intelligence agent, associate of the Grand Mufti, with Francois Genoud, the post-World War II Nazi banker and literary tract controller, I guess you could say, to coin a phrase. We also have Genoud handling funds apparently dispersed by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, and also handling the defense and the subsidizing for the trials of terrorists associated with Carlos the Jackal. Well, of course, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's terrorist organization, as we looked at in Radio Free America and others, in Radio Free America number 4 and other shows, the terrorist training for Gaddafi came from Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson, the, quote, ex-unquote CIA agents who were so very much involved with arming the Gaddafi machine. Incidentally, Frank Turple also boasted of training Carlos the Jackal, and as we looked at in Radio Free America number 4, Carlos the Jackal's life, apparently, according to Jack Anderson, was saved by the CIA. So there's an interesting connection there. On top of that, of course, we have the association of Muammar Gaddafi in a group called the International Fascista, which is, just as its name implies, an international fascist terrorist combine, and the co-bankroller of the Paladin mercenary group, one of the main elements of the International Fascista, was none other than Otto Skorzeny, working with Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. So Gaddafi and Skorzeny setting up Gaddafi's secret service, and work, of course, setting up the original Palestinian terrorists associated later with Gaddafi in the Paladin mercenary group. And we have, of course, this same milieu now intersecting directly with Francois Genoud and Jacques Verges, Barbie's defense attorney. Continuing now with Unhealed Wounds. But it was 1982, before the connections between the Palestinian left and the Nazi right resurfaced anew, and once again Jacques Verges was a principal player in the drama. So was his old friend, Francois Genoud. The case concerned the Paris trial of two terrorists known as the Friends of Carlos, unquote. Bruno Breguet, B-R-E-G-U-E-T, a 12-year veteran of pro-Palestinian terrorist action, and Magdalena Kopp, K-O-P-P, formerly of the Baader-Meinhof band, had been intercepted by the Paris police while carrying grenades and guns and 4 kilos of explosives in a borrowed car that was parked just off the Champs-Élysées. Jacques Verges was their lawyer and public apologist. Bruno Breguet had been on the terror circuit for more than a decade. In 1970, at the age of 20, the young Swiss had been sent by George Habash to plant a bomb in the Israeli port of Haifa. He was caught with dynamite on his person and jailed in Israel. But the most intriguing fact about the young left-wing revolutionary was that he became a protege of his fellow countryman Francois Genoud, a Nazi. Genoud later acknowledged his relationship with the PFLP. He corrected a journalist who had written that he had no connection, unquote, by saying that he, quote, had no particular connection, unquote, but had met Habash 1 or 2 times, again, unquote. In 1970, when the original Bruno Breguet case broke in Israel, Genoud, who was, in his own words, very available, traveled to Breguet's hometown of Tessen, Switzerland, to meet with the young man's family. Quote, they were lovely people, he recalled with the mildness of a fond uncle. I tried to help them. Help consisted once again of advice, unquote, and the recommendation of a young lawyer who later became Genoud's son-in-law. Quote, I was quite taken by the youth of this fellow citizen who had participated in this fair a little bit like a Boy Scout. At a time when so many young people didn't care about anything at all, he set off to do something interesting, recalled Genoud. According to Le Monde, Genoud paid for Breguet's legal costs and set up a support committee on his behalf. Given his relationship as a banker to the FLN, that's the Algerian independence movement, by the way, and his connections with al-Fatah and the PFLP, providing such financing was perfectly consistent behavior for Genoud. Breguet was sentenced to 15 years in prison in Israel, but released after 7 following a vigorous publicity and lobbying campaign conducted by the Breguet Support Committee. His first free act was to visit Lausanne to thank his benefactor. Genoud was vague about their subsequent relationship. Quote, I've seen him a few times since his release from prison. Sometimes he sends me a postcard he allowed. Bruno Breguet resumed his activities. By the 1970s, he too was involved in assisting the PLO in Europe through the Carlos Network. Let me repeat that last sentence. By the late 1970s, he too was involved in assisting the PLO in Europe through the Carlos Network. When the Breguet Kopp case came to trial in 1982, it was widely believed that Francois Genoud had once again paid Breguet's legal costs with money that had, after all, been earmarked for aid to the Palestinian cause. Breguet was a member of the PFLP, and Genoud was a longtime supporter of the same organization. Breguet had also lived in Berlin for a period during the 1970s, where he had easy access to the neo-Nazi groups that were dear to the heart of his benefactor. According to writer Claire Sterling, Genoud helped finance the Carlos Network in Paris in the early 1970s. 10 years later, it became evident that Bruno Breguet and Magdalena Kopp worked in the same network. In February of 1982, Carlos sent a letter to the French embassy in The Hague demanding the release of Breguet and Kopp. Quote, You have arrested members of my organization, he wrote by way of information. Carlos gave the French government 1 month to accede to his request, but the letter was leaked to the press, and naturally the government refused. There was no hard evidence to connect the events, but 4 days after the deadline expired, a bomb exploded on the Paris-Toulouse train, killing 5 people. The following day, the French Cultural Center in Beirut was damaged. On April 15th, a French military officer and his pregnant wife were shot at point-blank range when they opened the door to their apartment in Beirut. On April 18th, 2 bombs exploded simultaneously in Vienna, one at the Air France head office, the other in the garden of the French embassy. So recapping the significance of this, basically we have 2 associates, Bruno Breguet and Magdalena Kopp, European terrorists associated apparently with Carlos the Jackal, who we spoke about earlier, and they in turn are being defended by, not only Jacques Verges, but their defense is being financed by Francois Genoud, the post-World War II Nazi master, so to speak, or finance master, I guess would be a better way of putting it. Once again, we're going to take a short musical break, and then we're going to come back and finish up this first section of the prepared portion for this evening. Broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC Los Altos Hills. Well, good evening once again. We're returning to the prepared portion of One Step Beyond for this evening. By the way, my co-host Nip Tuck is ill this evening, and he is not going to be with us. In fact, I have a little bit of a head cold myself, so if I sound a little bit submarine, that's the reason why. Maybe he's got a worse version of what I have. Anyway, hope he effects a speedy recovery. And in the meantime, we will continue. By the way, speaking of broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC Los Altos Hills. Returning now to the intersections of a number of different things we've been talking about, specifically the post-World War II Nazi underground and overground, in fact, and not only Palestinian terrorism, but as we're going to see now, other elements of supposedly left European terrorism. Continuing now with Unhealed Wounds by Irna Paris. Following the Breguet cop affair, Jacques Verges became the lawyer for Mohand Hamami, that's H-A-M-A-M-I, and Frédéric Auriac, O-R-I-A-C-H, both members of the Paris-based multinational terror band called Direct Action, which was created in 1979. Hamami and Auriac were accused of breaking into an arsenal of arms that was under police surveillance. Auriac was also the editor of a glossy, anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist review called Subversion, a descendant of Verges' seminal publication, Révolution, which was described as, quote, a political and theoretical instrument at the disposition of militant revolutionaries, unquote. Furthermore, according to Italian magistrates interviewed by Le Figaro, Hamami was at the heart of a triple connection: Red Brigades, Direct Action, and the Lebanese armed revolutionary faction. A lot of interesting things in that particular passage, as short as it was. First of all, the fact that Direct Action, which is very much on the scene today, has been very active in recent months and years, has been represented as a leftist terrorist organization, that they should have this sort of connections to Jacques Verges, an ambiguous individual, but a fellow who has documented connections to Nazi financier Francois Genoud. It's interesting that this Direct Action group should have that kind of a connection. Furthermore, the Direct Action would be linked with the Red Brigades is also intriguing. Of course, in our series, our Radio Free America series about the shooting of the Pope, we took a look at how Licio Gelli of the P2 faction, the P2 Lodge in Italy, was credited with having a great deal to do with founding the Red Brigades. And of course, the Red Brigades have been instrumental in the so-called strategy of tension, which in turn has been it's been instrumental in driving the Italian public to the right. And, of course, their terrorist strategy is very discrediting to the left in general. In fact, the Italian Communist Party has completely disowned the Red Brigades. Continuing now with the last section that we're going to be looking at this evening from Unhealed Wounds by Irna Paris. And again, further developments connecting the Palestinian terrorist movement with the elements, with surviving elements of the Third Reich, that is, surviving the end of the Second World War. By 1985, the alliance of the old-style fascist right and the new-style revolutionary left had become more visible. The seeds of Nasser's Cairo in the 1950s and the 1969 meeting of the new European order in Madrid bearing fruit. In 1985, one of the left-wing Armenian terrorists defended by Jacques Verges was found to be carrying a German passport that had been stolen by the neo-Nazi Hoffmann Group and distributed in a PFLP training camp in Lebanon. And in April of 1985, an important double arrest in Paris netted Ottfried Hepp, H-E-P-P, the last member at large of the same Hoffmann organization, in the company of a Tunisian member of the Palestine Liberation Front. Hepp was suspected of having planned and or participated in the anti-Semitic attack on Goldenberg's restaurant in Paris in 1982. Hepp, however, claimed to be a member in good standing of the Palestine Liberation Front, Abu Abbas branch with its base in Tunis. I'm going to read that last sentence again because it's very significant. This Ottfried Hepp, remember, is a member of the neo-Nazi Hoffmann Sport Group Hoffmann, a very powerful and well-connected Nazi group in Germany. Hepp, however, claimed to be a member in good standing of the Palestine Liberation Front, Abu Abbas branch, with its base in Tunis. According to Arndt Heinz Marx, associate president until his arrest in 1984 of the neo-Nazi National Socialist Front in Frankfurt, both Hepp and Marx trained at an El Fatah camp in Lebanon from July of 1980 until June of 1981 with a group of 15 German neo-Nazis. Quote, "I was a member of El Fatah, a Fedayeen," said Marx. El Fatah and the PLO are fighting for the rights of their people as we are fighting for the German people. The Palestinians and ourselves have the same enemy, international Zionism and the Jews. Marx added that the guerrilla training in Lebanon was not, that guerrillas training in Lebanon were not intended to attack Israel directly, but were preparing, quote, for combat in Europe, unquote. As for Francois Genoud, his connections to both Nazism and the extreme left were evident and ongoing. In June of 1984, a Zurich newspaper pointedly reported that he had close ties with the Libyan embassy in Bern. Reading that last sentence again. In June of 1984, a Zurich newspaper pointedly reported that he had close ties with the Libyan embassy in Bern, and his own daughter, Martine, had been married to a revolutionary who was killed in an internecine battle in Lebanon in the early 1980s. A couple of comments about the last passage that we just read. One of the interesting things about the Nazi milieu that we've been discussing being connected with the Abu Abbas is that Abbas was connected, at least in the American press, and perhaps in reality, I can't say, but with the hijacking of the Achille Lauro in 1985. That was one of a series of terrorist acts that, completely dominated the American press in mid-1985, and which culminated in the hijacking of an airliner carrying the abduction, perhaps, hijacking, whatever you want to call it, of an airliner carrying some of the terrorists involved in this incident by aircraft from U.S. carriers with the Sixth Fleet. They were forced down in Italy. So it's interesting to have these Nazi connections with the Abu Abbas branch, the group credited with the Achille Lauro hijacking. It's also interesting that in June of 84, a Zurich newspaper should report that Francois Genoud, the Nazi financier who's been front and center in this section we've been looking at, should have close ties with the Libyan embassy in Bern. That is an interesting connection, obviously, falls directly in line with the historical thread that we've been tracing here. Now, before we go back and review the section from Unhealed Wounds that we've been looking at, that concludes the tape segment for tonight's broadcast. We're going to take a musical break, and then we're going to come back for some more information. And again, the information on that tape by way of documenting the connections between international fascism, the Palestinian and Iranian terrorists that have surfaced over the last 20 years in the news media, and the, elements of the avowed left or ostensible left, such as direct action, red brigades, etc. Again, tonight talking about the fascist third position. We're going to take a musical break and then back live for more information here on One Step Beyond at KFJC.
Won't Get Fooled Again, another appropriate song, I thought, to some of the stuff that we've been talking about tonight. And in fact, we have talked about a lot of people getting fooled again and again and again.
Or is it still?
Or is it still, indeed. And we might want to just quickly reinterpolate some of the stuff on that tape segment for people for the articles that we're going to finish up with tonight.
Basically, we traced elements of the third position of fascism all the way back through the seminal Reinhard Gehlen mission to the Middle East. Now, recall that the fledgling government of Gamal Abdel Nasser wanted some expertise in order to put together its general staff and military intelligence service. It went to the CIA. Because of America's relationship with Israel, Alan Dulles, then head of the CIA, did not want to use regular CIA people. So we turned to Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence chief for the Eastern Front during World War II, who jumped to the U.S. with his whole organization. And he took a bunch of Nazi war criminals, most of them affiliated with the Final Solution, and sent them over to form the Egyptian intelligence service, which they did. They also formed, under Otto Skorzeny, the first Palestinian terrorist groups in the Gaza Strip. They then went on to form the Libyan Secret Service, and that association, and we took a look at the association between Haj Amin al-Husseini, Francois Genoud, and Genoud was part of that mission. He was one of those German intelligencers who worked under the Skorzeny mission to the Middle East. So when we see Wahid Gorgi hooked up with Francois Genoud, it's worth bearing in mind just how far back many of these connections go. We talked about the Bandung Conference, at which the term Third World was coined, and this Nazi Middle Eastern intelligence group played a key role in that conference in the form of Haj Amin al-Husseini. And again, that was by way of tracing the historical roots of this, perhaps for some bizarre-seeming association between, quote, left, unquote, Palestinians and, quote, Islamic fundamentalists, and people who, as that article by Kevin Coogan and Marty Lee would indicate, people who should, by all rights, despise people like that if, and here's the key, one is to take their ideology at face value. In fact, what we're really looking at here as we see the terrorist thermometer being turned up in the Middle East, and consequently the patriotic/military thermometer being turned up in the United States, perhaps to the benefit of George Bush and or others. The thing to bear in mind here is that this is really an application of what the Nazis referred to as geopolitics, courtesy of Karl Haushofer, and this is an application of what we're seeing today.
Indeed. Again, as we've talked about in the past, a lot of people who first started listening to these shows and other people's work in this field and talking seemed rather surprised by the idea that the United States, that bastion of democracy, could have spent the time at the end of and immediately after World War II gathering up scads of Nazis to import into our own intelligence and defense establishments. But upon a little study, it becomes fairly obvious why that happened. In the same way, that has had an effect on our national policy, and more than an effect, it seems to have been one of the determining factors in our national policy since World War II. In the same way, when you think about you could almost say the primordial connections between the secret services of the Middle Eastern countries like Libya and Egypt, and their early affiliations, in fact, their birth out of fascist and Axis powers. It's not at all surprising, again, that the connections would still run so closely these days, and that, in fact, the nationalist movements in the Middle East would find it very easy to make contact and to work in conjunction with these self-same fascist groups that we've been talking about. We're going to explore a little more on that topic as we retreat briefly back into the mad whirl of the Mediterranean merry-go-round, but as we see, it also will have quite a bit to do with some of the things that are as current as today's headlines. And this also one of the articles for which we are grateful to our Italian translator, Dave. The article is originally printed in Il Messaggero for March 17th of 1987, and it's about the Giuliani group, a very interesting group that we're going to be talking about in the next few articles. It says, the Giuliani group, made up of about 30 young men active in Rome between 1972 and 1982, is an anomaly in the annals of terrorism. They operate against the system to the accompaniment of robberies and explosions. But here's the novelty. They have a foot in the ultra-right and a hand stretching toward the guerrillas of the left.
In the context of our broadcast here, perhaps novelty should have been in quotes.
Yeah, it's not much of a novelty for what we've been talking about at all. A foot in the ultra-right and a hand stretching towards the guerrillas of the left. It's based on the theory that, quote, if there is only one enemy, divisions make no sense. In short, a theory something like the old Nazi Maoist ones espoused in the late 60s by Franco Freda, but adapted to the rebellious climate that, after 1977, had infected all neo-fascists.
Recalling that Franco Freda was one of the Iranian-linked Italian fascists that we took a look at in the very first article that Nip read you and our Italian translator Dave researched.
That's right, and when Franco Freda had said when you are anti-Soviet, anti-American, and anti a variety of other things, that Khomeinism begins to look like a real serious alternative. Now, what we're talking about when he says anti-American, Franco Freda is talking about anti-democratic, which is not necessarily the same thing.
Although I think one of the things to be borne in mind, a lot of these fascists do hate the United States because of the what they view as America's betrayal by not backing them in their anti-Bolshevik crusade. But the thing to bear in mind is that these are foot soldiers. These aren't policymakers, and that not only American policymakers, but specifically those who are linked with some of the string pullers, some of the behind-the-scenes manipulators, like the Galen people, von Bolschwing, Francois Genoud, can use people like this precisely because they hate America. They can be used to attack NATO bases, and they have, as indicated in the Erna Paris segment there. And then, of course, it can be blamed on, the International Peace and Violence Brigade. It's a perfect provocation. But if the foot soldiers really do hate America, they can be very, very useful, what is known as a useful idiot in the intelligence parlance.
That's right. There are always those who are being manipulated unconsciously and others who are consciously allowing themselves to be manipulated.
Remembering an article that we looked at concerning an article about the French treatment of agents provocateurs called Cherchez le provocateur, and there's an old adage on the French right that it's always a good idea to let a few shops burn.
Indeed. Okay, speaking again of the idea that, quote, if there is only one enemy, divisions make no sense, and Nazi Maoist philosophies like those espoused by Franco Freda, Il Messaggero continues with the following, quote, the attack on Honeywell, this was an attack on the Honeywell Data Processing Center, and was basically caused an extreme amount of damage to the information processing ability of a large portion of Italy at that time. The attack on Honeywell was claimed, meaning proclaimed, in a leaflet written in the language of the left, unquote. That's how Laura Lauricella, a 27-year-old penitita, or reformed, in Rebibbia prison, recalls the most serious action carried out by the Giuliani group. In other words, it works real well when you cause a destruction of this kind, like the one wreaked upon the vengeance wreaked upon the Honeywell operation, and then call in and proclaim the language of the left in taking credit for it. Continuing on farther down in the article, again talking about this Giuliani group, and what of their contacts with the ultra-left. After his arrest, a militant of the Fighting Communist Union, Antonio Ginestra, told of being approached by members of the Giuliani group, who proposed an assault on a military van, the expected booty, $1.5 million. Okay, again, now the Fighting Communist Union, we've been talking about the
Fighting Communist Party or
earlier.
Fighting Communist Proletariat, because these are confusing names.
Indeed. The PCC we talked about earlier. Now we're talking about the Fighting Communist Union, or the UCC, a very interesting group. But just so we can put the UCC in the proper context, they're talking about this Giuliani group with admitted ties to the ultra-right, also approaching the Fighting Communist Union, a supposed ultra-left group, although as we'll see that's in question, and asking them if they wanted to join in an assault on a military van for presumably pecuniary gain as well as perhaps some political gains.
Now, one of the main escapades of the Fighting Communist Union, the UCC, as opposed to the PCC, the Iranian-linked Red Brigades group that also assassinated Senator Ruffili, member of the P2 investigation commission, the UCC, one of their most famous escapades was the assassination of Licio Gelli, an Italian Star Wars general. Reading now, and again, research and translation credit, as for the other articles, goes to our Italian translator, Dave, who's gone through, as I indicated at the top of the broadcast, a great deal to bring this information to us. This from the Corriere della Sera, excuse me, the Corriere della Sera for June 12th of 1987. The magistrates looking into the UCC's murder of Licio Gelli returned late this afternoon from a 3-day top-secret mission. Yesterday, Judges Rosario Priori and Domenico Sica stopped in Istanbul, Turkey. Some have connected this last part of their trip with the resumption of a course of inquiries opened by the revelations of Mehmet Ali Agha. So obviously that's a speculative connection, but it is an interesting place for somebody investigating the Red Brigades and a Red Brigades assassination to have stopped. Are too many Red Brigades in Istanbul, Turkey, or are there? Perhaps Mehmet Ali Agha has revealed more than we have learned.
And again, for those of you who tuned in late or who were somewhat bewildered by the barrage of names, remember one of the key players, if not the key player, in the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II, Licio Gelli, Grand Master of the P2 Lodge, not only through many connections intimately connected with Mehmet Ali Agha, the man who tried to kill Pope John Paul II, or at least took shots at him, but Licio Gelli himself, also one of the founders of the Red Brigade, so not a surprising connection. Another not-so-surprising connection, unless you believe the public speeches of these various left and right-wing groups, but if you've begun to look underneath the covers, as it were, to see what strange bedfellows might be found there, our next article, also one of our Italian translations from Dave, will not particularly surprise you. It's from the La Repubblica for February 16th of 1984. And it says, it's just a short snip, it says, in a couple of Red Brigade's bases uncovered in Venetia, investigators found newspaper clippings and photographs of Judge Carlo Palermo, head of an investigation into the arms and drug traffic. We might add, Judge Carlo Palermo was one of the key players and certainly the most discussed and the most public of the investigators of Stiebaum and the P2 Lodge scandal. Again, the Red Brigades, a supposed leftist group who, if one would...
if we could see Licio Gelli as a leftist, they're a leftist group.
Yes, if one would take them at face value, one would think, what better thing that the Red Brigades could hope for if they're truly leftists who want to smash the state than to see the P2 revelations come to full flower and show just how corrupt the government actually is. Well, we already talked about one leftist group being involved in the slaughter of Senator Ruffili, somebody investigating the P2 and other related scandals, and now we see that the Red Brigades was apparently stalking or considering stalking Judge Carlo Palermo, the head of the investigation into those self-same scandals.
And interestingly enough, just as the Pope shooting trial was getting underway under Judge Martella, Carlo Palermo, who had recently been transferred to a very precarious judgeship in Sicily, in a very mafia-active part of Sicily, where his predecessor had been killed by the mafia, narrowly escaped assassination by a very powerful car bomb just as the Pope shooting trial was getting underway. Now, remember the Fighting Communist Union, that's the UCC, that assassinated Italian Star Wars General Licio Gelli, and that may be connected with the Grey Wolves, Mehmet Ali Aja, etc. Remember that they were hooked up with the Giuliani group, okay? Because now we're going to see the Giuliani group hooking up with the Red Brigades in an indirect sort of way, or a complicated way, I should say, not indirect, and with the Stiebom Arms for Drugs ring, or people connected to it.
Buckle your seatbelts, folks.
This is sort of a tortuous article because this is based on information presented by a fellow named Mino Pecorelli, who was, as the article indicates, deliberately equivocal in the way he expressed things. I guess he did not want to get the Bakir Chalenk Michele Sindona prison breakfast. That, folks, is toast with Licio Gelli. A lot of people in Italy, as well as the United States, who begin revealing interesting information have a way of experiencing suddenly failing health. And so perhaps he's being deliberately equivocal here in order to remain deliberately alive. Again, research and translation credit to our Italian translator, Dave. This from Panorama from June 12th of 1988. And yet, just in relation to the imprisonment of Moro, that of course is Aldo Moro, assassinated former Italian Prime Minister, killed by the Red Brigades, and yet just in relation to the imprisonment of Moro, someone high up had to know. One need only read again the top informant Pecorelli, who often got his news from the Secret Services. In the OP issue of October 17, 1978, when the importance of Via Montalcini, Montalcini, was known to everyone, Pecorelli wrote in his typical elusive style, quote, "The Minister of Police knew everything. He even knew where Moro had been held prisoner, in parts of the ghetto, ... drunk, end parentheses." The article goes on. He wrote just like that, quote, "ghetto," unquote, 3 dots, and the word drunk in parentheses, as if to underline a message. What did he want to say? The Malyana district, Magliana, the Malyana district, as one knows, is considered in Rome as the ghetto district, or more simply, as the ghetto. Enclosed in parentheses, the word drunk, in the writing of Pecorelli, may refer to Montalcini, a Jew, and hence to the street that bears his name and is close to Malyana. Another name, that, as we'll soon see, has exceptional importance in this story. From whom had Pecorelli learned the name of that street? And why, back then, did he refer to the street that is now known as the Malyana Trail, unquote. I'm going to read the last sentence again, the last couple of sentences. Enclosed in parentheses, the word drunk in the writing of Pecorelli may refer to Montalcini, a Jew, and hence to the street that bears his name and is close to Malyana. Another name that, as we'll soon see, has exceptional importance in this story. From whom had Pecorelli learned the name of that street? And why, back then, did he refer to the street that is now known as the Malyana Trail, unquote? To answer, we must listen to another friend of Tony Ciccarelli, the man who, with his Polaroid, possibly entered the People's Prison, unquote, in Via Montalcini. Tony Ciccarelli is spelled Chiccicciarelli. Continuing. Speaking before the magistrates this time as Osvaldo Lay, L-A-I, a Roman business consultant. He explains that, quote, "My friend Tony was well connected with notorious Roman criminals," unquote. Affirmation that Ciccarelli's wife, Chiara Zossolo, Z-O-S-S-O-L-O, was talking explicitly about the Malyana Band, the powerful organization of arms and drug traffickers who had contacts with terrorists and the Secret Services. "My husband," says Zossolo, "knew Danilo Abruzzati well. One of the heads was Domenico Balducci and Egidio Giuliani, that's from the Giuliani group we referred to earlier, of the Malyana band, killed in 1982 while attempting to assassinate the ex-vice president of Banco Ambrosiano, Roberto Rassone. Balducci is the man of Malyana who, pursued by the police of central Italy, traveled without fear in Secret Service planes in the course of mysterious operations. Well, Balducci and Abruzzati are also affiliated with the Stibom Arms for Drugs ring, and obviously so too is another member of the so-called Malyana group, Egidio Giuliani. That's the fellow who's hooked up with the Fighting Communist Union, the UCC, that we looked at just a couple of minutes ago. And again, this is a tangled and tortuous web. It is the Mediterranean merry-go-round, but it is interesting to see this continuing pattern of the joining together of elements of the ostensible left and the right who form a community of interest and in all probability are really indistinguishable.
And just to put some of this back into the necessary perspective, as Dave mentioned, the Michele Sindona prison breakfast, there are people who are capable of dishing out the prison breakfast, and very few people want to take the prison breakfast. And at times like that, when there's some question as who's going to be eating breakfast and who's going to be paying the tab, it's good to let people know that you know the chef. And Licio Gelli appears to be doing just that right now. This article, was this also one of Dave's? I didn't...
you got
yes.
that too, yeah.
All right. From the Swiss Journal, which is an American... it's a newspaper about Swiss matters, but it's not from Switzerland, not printed in Switzerland. It's for May 18th of 1988, and the article is headlined, Gelli's, quote, revelations chill hearts of top Italians. Goes like this. Licio Gelli has started to talk, an event which, in prospect, was said to be chilling the hearts of many of the top people in Italy. After being extradited from Switzerland in February, then released from prison last week, the 69-year-old Grand Master of the P2 Masonic Lodge has begun to state his public defense against a host of charges ranging from involvement in neo-fascist terrorism to huge bank fraud. On Thursday evening, Mr. Gelli appeared on the main television news program to assure the nation that he was enraged by accusations of involvement in the bombing of Bologna railway station in 1980, which killed more than 80 people. He had committed no crimes and in time would reveal all that he knew about the scandals and outrages with which his name had been associated, he said. Yesterday, La Repubblica published a full-page interview with the Venerabile, who confirmed the impression that he is in tip-top form, despite what is alleged to be a serious heart condition. He skillfully revealed nothing of great substance, but, by scattering famous names like confetti, may have further lowered the temperatures of other, even more celebrated hearts. He confided that he had hidden abroad the 500-page testimony of Michele Sindona, the Sicilian banker who died of poisoning in an Italian prison 3 years ago. He also believed that another of his friends, the late Roberto Calvi, the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, who masterminded the melting away of millions of dollars of the bank's funds, had been pushed into suicide. He himself had not even cashed a check with Ambrosiano, said Mr. Gelli, let alone taken possession of any of its funds. The millions in his Swiss bank account were his own, and he had offered to lend Calvi money, thinking that, quote, perhaps Roberto could do with $200 million. He laced the interview with references to people with whom he had taken coffee. Flaminio Piccoli, a past secretary of the Christian Democrat Party, who denies ever meeting Mr. Gelli. Mr. Bettino Craxi, the Socialist Party leader, whom he says he met on several occasions, although Mr. Craxi claims they had only one encounter. He further claimed exchanges with the former Prime Minister, Mr. Giulio Andreotti, now Foreign Minister, and says he presented a plan for the, quote, rebirth of Italy in the 1970s at the request of then-President Giovanni Leone. Was he involved in talk of a military coup? Many of his friends had been generals, said Mr. Gelli, but, quote, Italian politicians can sleep easy. There will never be a coup in Italy. We don't have any generals, just empty uniforms. Mussolini was right. Quote, it is not difficult to govern the Italian people. It is useless. Unquote. Again, Mr. Licio Gelli, a man who knows just about everything and can be reliably thought to probably be imparting about 1/10 of what he knows in terms of the truth factor of what he talks about, but probably pushing a great deal of buttons that most of us don't even recognize, even in the untruths that he is putting forward.
It should be noted, too, that if Licio Gelli ever really decides to unburden himself, He's going to shake loose a lot of pegs here on this side of the Atlantic as well as over there, because again, with the Billygate scandal involving Michele Papa, Gaddafi's representative in Italy, and others, we see the P2 nexus operating in a big way in the United States. And again, Dave got us some fantastic articles about Michele Papa and some of his activities with Palestinian and Middle Eastern terrorists, so we won't have time to go into those today, perhaps next week. We'll continue with the politics of the third position of fascism next week. Now.
Bingo. And with that, we are going to say goodnight, and we will see you next Sunday at 7 o'clock. Until then, thank you for joining us. This is Nip Tuck and Dave Emery saying, broadcasting from Foothill College, this is KFJC, Los Altos Hills. Giuseppe Ipalomeni, and investigating magistrate Felice Casson, that contacts between Italian neo-fascists and Iranian exiles are solid. Let me just give you that's the meat of it right there. A glance among the letters and pamphlets gives understanding to the head of Digos, Giuseppe Ipalomeni, and investigating magistrate Felice Casson that contacts between Italian neo-fascists and Iranian exiles are solid. Our story begins in the Venice apartment of Abedi Tari, T-A-R-I, a 37-year-old student. Police find lots of money and evidence of big or long trips. The best secrets are messages written in Arabic directly from the Tehran government. For some time, it's been known that Italian neo-fascists, especially friends of Franco Freda, F-R-E-D-A, recently acquitted for the Piazza Fontana massacre, have been attracted to Islam via, quote, exiles from Marxism and capitalism, unquote. Freda, interviewed by Panorama, says, quote, for one who is anti-American, anti-Soviet, and anti-Zionist like me, Khomeiniism is a hope. One has to go back to the 13th century to find another experience so bright, unquote. Freda's admiration for Iran's leader goes back many years. Quote, when Khomeini was in exile in Paris, some of my comrades brought him my books, and he deigned to bless them, unquote. Old acquaintances like Professor Claudio Muti want to give legal aid to an Islamic-leaning magazine called Jad, J-A-D.
I suspect that may be Jihad.
It could be, or it could just be the Italian version of Jihad, published in Carmagnola. Skipping down. Abedi Tari, investigators suspect, this is the 37-year-old student, investigators suspect may not be alone. From here it goes to other inquiries in Padua, Milan, Genoa, Rome, Perugia, Lecce, Reggio Calabria, and Catania. In Catania, in the mosque on Via Castomarini, a meeting is uncovered between the Islamic Students Association and the lawyer Michele Papa, Gaddafi's representative in Sicily. Undoubtedly an interesting circumstance, but still not enough to make a determined step in the investigation. Abedi Tari, we'll mention that later.
Yeah, I think probably there's such a long article, and all these articles are so involved, plus it's translated, that maybe we should probably go back and hit each point as we go through.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. Among other things, they mentioned Michele Papa, Gaddafi's representative in Sicily. Now, Gaddafi, as longtime listeners to the show know, Gaddafi has a longtime affiliation with the Italian left and with the O-line fascist European left in general, including
European right.
European right. I'm sorry. Thank you.
But actually, it is.
Yeah, I was going to say
fascist European left.
We're going to flip-flop back and forth on this a lot tonight. Gaddafi has a long-time relationship with the European right, including one of the leaders ever since the end of World War II of the European right, Otto Skorzeny, who, with Muammar Gaddafi, funded the Paladin Group, which was part of the International Fascista, which is about as far to the right as you can get.
One of the things, too, we're not going to have time to get into them this evening, perhaps in one of the future broadcasts on the subject. You heard the name there, Michele Papa. Now, that's an interesting fellow who he's Gaddafi's representative in Italy, as the article indicates. He's also a fellow who hooks up with Italian fascists, and although the name may not be too familiar to Americans, he helped decide the 1980 election by working with Francesco Pazienza and Michael Ledeen on the Billygate story. And, of course, Mo Gaddafi comes into that one, too. More later.
That's right. So, a meeting between the Islamic Students Association and the aforementioned Michele Papa, Gaddafi's representative in Sicily. Abedi Tari is the leader of a group composed of 8 Iranian students, a Syrian, and a Lebanese. The group moves from city to city, organizes, quote, general European seminaries, unquote, probably seminars, and telephones, analogous working groups
be hooked up with so many of the very terrorists that it professes to be opposed to.
Just like the Reaganites and the Gaddafis seem as if they must be at opposite ends of the spectrum, but when you look a little more closely, you find out they're working together. Just as Licio Gelli and his right-wing para-fascist friends in Italy and the Ayatollah's folks in Iran seem like they must be at opposite ends of the spectrum, and then when you examine a little more closely, you find that they are in fact quite similar and quite connected. And well, in the same way, something we were talking about at the beginning of the broadcast, and I wanted to underline again, in the same way, those of us who are out there receiving this kind of stuff, having it handed to us as daily news, no matter how different we all are, we're in the same position too. In other words, if you're somebody who is going to see this story, for instance, about the Iranian airline that we've been talking about a little bit tonight, it's been shot down. If you're the kind of slack-jawed idiot who's going to open the paper tomorrow and say, well, son of a gun, I guess they had it coming. Or conversely, if you are the kind of person who's going to pick it up and say, oh, how horrible, what a terrible thing to happen. Whether you're somebody who's going to blame the Reagan administration, whether you're somebody who's going to blame the Ayatollah Khomeini, the differences are not so important as the fact that you're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat on this, which is we have been manipulated, and we are continuing to be manipulated. And as long as we believe these stories that are handed out, no matter what we believe or how we react to them, we are being manipulated. We are not reacting to the real news. One
of the concepts to bear in mind as you listen to what the long article Nip is about to read you, and again, this all of the articles with two exceptions this evening were gleaned for us by Dave, our Italian translator, and he's not from Italy, but he translates the Italian press for us. The Germans have a term called Interessengemeinschaft, or community of interest. There's no precise English equivalent. That's what the IG in IG Farben stands for, and it means a community of interest. It doesn't necessarily imply a conspiracy, although it implies that indirectly, but it implies that after a while people learn which pellet to push which lever to push in order to get their food pellet. One of the things to think about is the relative domestic bankruptcy of the policies both of Ronald Reagan and the Ayatollah Khomeini. Both have been a stone disaster on the home front, and really, I think people should think about the extent to which each of these aging, sick old men has been able to rule primarily by whipping up the war Fuhrer and waving the flag and invoking the names of their martyred young men, etc., and basically to create a media circus and sort of a mini Nuremberg rally. People should consider that particular tactic and see to what extent people like Muammar Gaddafi, people like Ayatollah Khomeini, and people who would appear to be on the opposite side of the spectrum, and note the use of the term appear, like Ronald Reagan, in fact, have many things in common, and that if they learn to perhaps send a few people out to get killed, and they may learn that eventually they have, it's worth keeping each other around because they can keep each other in power.
Symbiosis is the word. We are going to read one of the aforementioned Italian translations, this one from Panorama magazine of February 14th, 1988, and you'll hear a bunch of names you don't know, some of them you may know, and we'll go back and straighten some of this up for you. Anyway, from Panorama, again, translated by Dave, our Italian translator. Surprise! In the same Vicenza post box, messages arrive for both militants of the extreme right and friends of the Islamic Students Association. For the DIGOS, the DIGOS, who'd already picked up signals of solidarity between Iranians and the NAR, this is the chance for vigorous inquiries. In Rovigo, in the home of Giovanni Melioli, a neo-fascist defendant in the Bologna trial, that's the Bologna railway station bombing trial, appears other pro-Khomeini material. The Italian, quote, the Italian popular vanguards express solidarity with the Iranian people, quote, unquote. A glance among the letters and pamphlets gives understanding to the head of DIGOS. DIGOS in this case is the investigating groups in Paris and Bonn. In Italy, it's been operating since 1984 and already has an imposing mass of index card files on, quote, enemies of the revolution, unquote. Skipping down in the article. The investigators keep wiretaps. Sometimes they run into words like, before I start this, I want to mention, we're going to see an example of who an enemy of the revolution, according to these people, appears to be, or the kind of person that seems to be an enemy of the revolution. We talk about Senator Ruffili a little later on. The investigators keep wiretaps. Sometimes they run into words like arms, carpets, drugs. Witnesses confirm that Abedi Tari was seen supervising arms shipments to Iran in the ports of Venice and Talamone. The suspicions remain simply that. until Abedi calls a number in Genoa. It corresponds to the Islamic Republic Shipping Company. Digos, again, the investigating agency, seizes documents that reveal an arms traffic. The company in Genoa puts police on the trail of 3 others very important in the field of commerce and the manufacture of arms and explosives. The European Armaments Company, SEA, in Turin, Consar, C-O-N-S-A-R, in Rome, and Remie, R-E-M-I-E, in Vicenza. The documents seized are really explosive. They reveal a traffic not only to Iran from Italy, but also to Iran from Bulgaria, France, West Germany, even Yugoslavia. Digos finds plane tickets at SEA that prove trips carried out by Tehran's rulers. In Vicenza, as a result of evidence found at the Remie Company, police reopened their investigation into a Red Brigades faction which used the obsolete name, quote, Fighting Communist Proletariat, or, its initials in Italian, PCC. Okay, let me give that to you again because we're going to get into the UCC later on. Okay, so Digos, investigating this connection between the Islamic student group and their connection with various shipping companies who are sending arms to Iran, finds plane tickets proving trips carried out by Tehran's rulers, and in Vicenza, as a result of evidence found at the Remie Company, police reopened their investigation into a Red Brigades faction which used the obsolete name Fighting Communist Proletariat, otherwise known as the PCC. The instigators of an abortive attack last February, the PCC, the instigators of an abortive attack last February. And it's uncovered in Rome that the Consar company is connected, along with SEA, to the French arms maker Luchaire. Okay, so again, a very complex web of names. Some of them, as Dave mentioned, we've heard already. Certainly Franco Freda, we've talked about the Piazza Fontana massacre bombing, the Bologna railway station bombing, very familiar to us. One of the things most familiar to us about these is the involvement of a man by the name of Stefano Della Chiai. Stefano Della Chiai, of course, linked heavily to not only to Licio Gelli, who we'll talk about later, and we've talked about a great deal, but to European fascism in general, and also to something called the third position, the terza posizione, the strange Maoist Hitlerite philosophy that has been used as an excuse for certain terrorist activities that seem to benefit nobody except the extreme right.
Not only Hitler and Mao, but also Gaddafi. The slogan is Hitler and Mao united in struggle, and they use a philosophy, and it's a fascist philosophy. It should be noted, this is not a progressive philosophy. It uses a fascist philosophy, which is an infusion of Hitler, Mao, and Gaddafi. And the Piazza Fontana massacre is interesting, too, because one of the people indicted in that was a P2 Italian intelligence official and fascist named Guido Giannattini, who was associated with the third position. He was not only involved with the Piazza Fontana, but interestingly enough, he served as an agent, an arms distributor for the BND, the Galen organization, which was distributing arms to the Italian far right under the auspices of Merex, a company which we're going to touch on later in connection with names like Mansour el-Qassar, Abu Abbas, Oddfried Hepp, and that erstwhile American patriot Oliver North.
As a matter of fact, a
couple of Turks are supposedly threatening him, although now the Austrian authorities have said that was just a hoax. It's interesting that the Turkish front, so to speak, seems to be heating up at the same time. We're going to take a look again at the trip to Istanbul, Turkey, of the people investigating the link between the Fighting Communist Unit and Licio Gelli, an assassinated Italian Star Wars general. Then we're going to take a look at another almost predictable development from the standpoint of long-time One Step Beyond and Radio Free America listeners, namely the fact that in a Red Brigades hideout, it was discovered that the Red Brigades were showing a lot of interest in Judge Carlo Palermo, the fellow who began investigating the Stee-Bomb Arms for Drugs ring, which figures not only in the shooting of Pope John Paul II, but apparently also in the Iran-Contra scandal. As we've seen, those two have dovetailed very nicely. Then we're going to take a look at a connection between the Giuliani group, the group hooked up with the Fighting Communist Union, and the assassination of Aldo Moro, and we'll talk more about that later, and connections between the Giuliani group, the Red Brigades involved in the Moro killing, and, that's right, some of the people involved with Stee-Bomb. And we're going to close with an interesting article from the Swiss Journal about Licio Gelli and some of the things he's been saying in Italy. And when Licio speaks, many, many people quake in their boots in Italy, and that's exactly what this article says. The boy is rattling them bones, and a lot of people are sweating under the arms in Italy. Okay, first article. And research credit on this goes to another one of our listeners, not Dave, our Italian translator, but a fellow named Jim, who used to be our phone screener here and is still on deck and doing some magnificent work. This article was carried in a lot of the local papers. Jim dug this up for us out of the Los Angeles Times of June 28th of 1988. It's a story by Norman Kempster of the LA Times. It's dateline Washington and headlined, Khomeini still secretly getting U.S. arms, Iranian rebels charge. Anti-Khomeini Iranian rebels have captured documents indicating that the Iranian government continues to obtain weapons from the United States, a senior rebel official claimed Monday. Soon, in a press conference, we will reveal documents showing that weapons are still going to the regime from the United States, Moshe Rezai, who functions as foreign minister for the rebels, told reporters. He was in Washington for a rally to celebrate the rebels' victory earlier this month in the Iranian border town of Mehran. The Reagan administration maintains that it halted all weapons deliveries to Iran after the Iran-Contra scandal broke almost 2 years ago. Rezai's trip is part of a campaign by the Mujahideen, the rebel organization, to establish its credibility as a serious opposition group that might someday displace the government of the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And so again, we don't know, we can't obviously verify those reports 100%, but it is consistent with something that we've seen over the years, which is that the United States has a very interesting way of arming an awful lot of the people it winds up going into battle against. And again, people should consider the possible motives for this, whether perhaps the arms deals are being used as vehicles for infiltration. In a very key section from Le Matin in June of 1984 that we went over in Radio Free America number 20, in discussing how arms deals are used as an instrument of foreign policy, Glauco Partel, a fellow from the Stiebom Arms for Drug Ring, was describing that the illicit under-the-table sale of arms serves as a very effective device of foreign policy because it permits the circulation of bribes and thereby political control. And what he didn't say is it also permits infiltration and the eventual co-opting of some of these terrorist groups. And again, the theme of tonight's broadcast, I guess, is the merging of the left and right for whatever purpose. That is the fascist third position. And we're going to be taking a look at some of the connections between Islamic fundamentalists, Palestinian activists and terrorists, and ultra-fascists, both in Italy, France, and also in the United States. And again, one of the things that lurks in the background of all of this is Ali North, his connections with Mansour el-Qassar of Abu Abbas fame and Abu Nidal fame, and some of the interesting connections between the Reagan White House, which is inveigled so heavily against inveigled, is that the word? Inveigled, I think, against terrorism so heavily over the years, and yet seems to... At any rate, let me give you a rundown of what you're going to be hearing this evening. We're going to take a look at an account from the Iranian Mujahideen, namely the people rebelling against Ayatollah Khomeini, that in fact the United States is still selling arms to Iran. That may change, but that will serve as sort of a kicker for the broadcast this evening. After that, we're going to take a look at a fantastic article, one of many dug up for us by our Italian translator, Dave, and again, the fellow who's been basically paying the price for doing this kind of excellent and revelatory work. We're going to take a look at some very, very interesting connections between Italian and French fascists and the Iranian Islamic militants who have been holding sway in Iran for the last 8 years and have been dominating the headlines in the last couple of days or so. Then we're going to take a look at the intersection, first of all, between an Italian fascist named Milioli, another Italian fascist named Franco Freda, both affiliated with the Piazza Fontana and Bologna bombings, and the Iranian Islamic militants. We're also going to take a look, interestingly enough, at the involvement of Iranian militants in Italy, the same forces and elements of the Red Brigades, a Red Brigade unit called the Fighting Communist Proletariat, or Fighting Communist Party, as it's now known. Interestingly enough, that group took credit for the assassination last April of an Italian senator named Ruffili, who, interestingly enough, just happened to have been on the commission that investigated the Propaganda Due Lodge. That they do tend to work that way. Then we're going to look at a very fine article which will anticipate, in many ways, next week's material. This is an article from the Oakland Tribune by Kevin Coogan and Marty Lee, and it will deal with connections between French fascists and Iranian militants, and in particular a fellow named Francois Genoud, who was a Nazi intelligencer from World War II, a Swiss Nazi financier, and a fellow very much involved with the Nazi-generated Middle Eastern terrorism that we focused on in RFAs 4, 22, and 31 and 32, to one extent or another. Then we're going to play a segment, a long tape segment, maybe 45 to 50 minutes or so. That is going to consist of some material from a book called Unhealed Wounds by Erna Paris, a book both Nip and I stand on with both feet. One of the best books I think ever written about the actual dynamics of world fascism and international terrorism and how they work together. This is going to deal with the intersection of people like Francois Genoud, Jacques Verges, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the SS major who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and much of the third position direct action Middle Eastern terrorist milieu, which is going to occupy the focus for tonight's broadcast. After that, we're going to take a look. Well, after that, we're going to take a break. Then we're going to take a look at a group called the Giuliani Group, which is a group of Italian gangsters which was affiliated both with right and left-wing terrorism. They lurk in the background of the Bologna bombing. They also are hooked up with a group of Red Brigade terrorists called the Fighting Communist Union. Now, that's different from the Fighting Communist Proletariat or Fighting Communist Party. We're talking PCC and UCC, although the PCC and UCC seem to be pretty much two different sides of the same unfortunate coin.
CC.
Yep. And we're going to take a look, first of all, at the intersection between the Giuliani Group and the UCC, the Fighting Communist Union. Then we're going to take a look at the interesting link-up between the Fighting Communist Union, their assassination of an Italian Star Wars general, Licio Gelli, and we're going to take a look at the investigating the people investigating that crime and their stop-off in, of all places, Istanbul, Turkey, which led Italian journalists to speculate that they were possibly looking once again into, that's right, Mehmet Ali Aja and the shooting of Pope John Paul II. You notice some Turks were recently threatening the Pope. There had been a lot of things happening on the Turkish front. The Turkish Premier Özal escaped assassination at the hands of a gray wolf, then immediately came to the United States, and he, I guess, was about to complain about a reduction in U.S. aid. I wonder if perhaps he received some instructions along with that bullet, and if perhaps that toned down his ire somewhat. Then the Pope goes to Austria to talk with Kurt Waldheim, and